The story of the Ottoman Empire begins not with an explosion of power, nor with a sudden rise of armies, but with a gentle murmur, almost an unnoticed breeze passing over the Anatolian plains. To understand how an empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents began its journey, we have to return to a time when the land itself seemed exhausted, when civilizations that once shone brilliantly had faded into a long, weary dusk. It is in this tired landscape of the late 13th century that the foundations of the Ottomans emerge. Anatolia in this era is a land shaped by silence as much as by conflict. Centuries earlier, the Seljuk Turks had brought vitality, building cities, caravansaries, and vibrant trade routes. But by the 1200s, their power had been shattered. The Mongol invasions had swept repeatedly across the region, leaving many settlements deserted and many people displaced. The great cities were shadows of what they had once been. Trade had slowed, culture had dimmed. These lands were, in many ways, waiting for stability, waiting for a new rhythm of life, waiting for a power that could bring calm after so much turbulence. Into this atmosphere of quiet uncertainty stepped a small group of nomadic Turks, led by a man named Ertugrul. Almost everything about Ertugrul is uncertain. Historians know little with absolute clarity. His story, like a distant shape seen through early morning mist, is formed as much from legend as fact. Yet legend itself tells us something important. His memory persisted, his presence mattered. People remembered him as the beginning of something greater. Ertugrul and his followers settled in Sagat, a modest location near the crumbling frontier of the Byzantine Empire. Sagat was not a glittering city, nor a strategic hub of immense importance. It was, instead, a quiet place, a borderland village surrounded by soft hills, open pastures, and lands suitable for grazing. But sometimes history chooses the quietest places to sprout its largest seeds. Life in Sagat must have been simple and slow. The nomads set up tents, built wooden homes, and tended their animals. Their world was defined by the rhythm of the seasons, warm summers on the plains, colder months spent in sheltered valleys. There were no grand palaces or marble halls, just the crackle of evening fires, the creak of leather saddles, and the low hum of distant winds. In these calm surroundings, Ertugrul's son Osman grew up. Osman, who would give his name to the Ottoman Empire, likely spent his childhood surrounded by these sounds, horses breathing softly at night, elders telling stories under the stars, and warriors sharpening swords not for conquest, but for the simple necessity of survival. His future as a founder of a great empire was invisible then. He was just a young boy living on the edge of 2 worlds, the declining Byzantine frontier on one side, and the frontier of Turkic nomadic culture on the other. As Osman reached adulthood, the world around him was changing. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, was weak and fragmented. Small forts and villages along the frontier were poorly defended, often disconnected from imperial authority. Meanwhile, scattered Turkic groups roamed the borderlands, creating a diverse and unstable mix of cultures, religions, and loyalties. Yet within this instability lay opportunity. The culture that shaped Osman was known as the Gaza ethos, the spiritual and cultural idea of fighting in the name of expanding Muslim influence. But this concept was more than religious. It was also a social and economic system. It united warriors, gave purpose to raids, and attracted individuals from different tribes. The frontier was full of men seeking land, wealth, and recognition. A leader who could gather and organize such energy would find himself with a growing following. Osman gradually became that leader. People began to speak his name quietly, respectfully. They admired his fairness, his generosity, and his patience. He did not gain power through dramatic battles or bold declarations. Instead, his influence expanded in a calm, steady manner, like water spreading through the roots of a vast tree before it finally breaks the soil and reveals its height. Small victories against local Byzantine forces increased his reputation. These were not the large-scale battles that fill history books, but tiny struggles, capturing a tower, defending a village, helping farmers reclaim fields from bandits. Yet each small event strengthened his position. Bit by bit, Osman transformed a tiny tribal group into a functioning beylik, a principality. One of the quiet turning points came when Osman declared his independence. There were no trumpets, no ceremonies, no witnesses from great powers. It was a simple moment, almost mundane in appearance, but monumental in consequence. The Seljuk Sultanate, which once commanded the loyalty of many Turkic tribes, no longer held meaningful authority. Osman's declaration was less rebellion and more acknowledgement of reality. His people would follow him alone. And follow him they did. The tiny Ottoman principality began to grow. Settlers came from surrounding regions. Nomads seeking stability chose Osman's lands. Even Christians from nearby Byzantine villages came under Ottoman administration, drawn by the calmness and order that Osman and his followers brought. Taxes were fair. Protection was reliable. Life in this small, growing beylik moved slowly but steadily, a kind of peaceful order that was rare in Anatolia at the time. Imagine the evenings in early Ottoman Sagat, smoke rising gently from cooking fires, children playing near wooden homes, old warriors telling tales of harsh winters and long migrations. The air is cool, the dusk settles gradually, painting the horizon with soft tones of purple and red. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse neighs. And Osman, perhaps sitting near a quiet fire, plans not the conquest of continents, but simply how to keep his people safe for another season. Yet these quiet decisions, these calm nights, these unremarkable moments, together they built the foundation of an empire. From this simplicity, a structure would rise that would one day dominate vast territories, shape global politics, and survive for more than 6 centuries. But that is still far in the future. For now, the story rests in the gentle beginnings, a small village, a calm frontier, a patient leader, and the early whispers of a destiny not yet understood. Osman's rising influence and the slow expansion of a frontier principality. As the tranquil rhythm of life continued across the rolling hills of Sagat, Osman Bey stood at the center of a subtle but meaningful transformation. Nothing about these early years of expansion was dramatic. There were no sweeping invasions, no thunderous armies marching in unison. Instead, Osman's principality expanded gently, almost imperceptibly, like a tree whose roots deepen quietly beneath the soil, only revealing their strength long after the growth has already occurred. By the late 13th century, Osman's small beylik was beginning to attract attention. Travelers passing through the frontier spoke softly of a leader who combined courage with restraint, ambition with modesty, and strength with a disarming simplicity. In a region plagued by instability, Osman represented something rare: consistency. Most political entities around him were either collapsing or transforming. The Byzantine Empire was struggling with internal strife and external threats. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, once the dominant Muslim power in Anatolia, was fading under Mongol influence. Other Turkic principalities, Karaman, Jermian, Aydin, and many smaller ones, were forming, merging, or battling among themselves. In this fluid and shifting world, Osman's beylik was small, even insignificant at first glance. Yet it held something the others lacked: an unusually steady center. The people around him sensed this steadiness. They gathered around his leadership not because of extravagant promises or grand visions, but because Osman offered something practical and deeply valued: security. His rule was known for order in a time without much order, predictability in an era that felt dangerously unpredictable. And so, slowly, families migrated into his territory. Shepherds, artisans, farmers, and wandering warriors all began to settle under Osman's banner, expanding the social foundation of the early Ottoman state. The frontier world. To understand Osman's rise, one must picture the frontier world as it truly was: not a neat line dividing Christian and Muslim realms, but a wide, overlapping zone of interaction. This frontier was a mosaic of abandoned Byzantine farms, quiet monasteries, small fortified villages, and clusters of nomadic tents. It was a place where identities blended, where political boundaries were blurry, and where loyalties shifted depending on which leader offered better protection. Many Christian peasants, weary of Byzantine taxation and neglect, found Osman's administration preferable. They were not forced to convert, they were allowed to retain their religion and livelihoods. In return, they paid a tax known as harik, but this burden was often lighter than what they had endured before. Thus, the Ottoman Beylik gradually absorbed a population diverse in background but united under Osman's calm governance. This blending of communities helped create something distinctive. While many other principalities were dominated almost exclusively by Turkic nomads, the early Ottomans formed a hybrid society, combining nomadic martial traditions with settled agricultural life. This balance, between movement and settlement, between the sword and the plow, would shape Ottoman identity for centuries to come. A leader without hurry. One of the defining features of Osman's expansion was its pace. There was no rush, no attempt to conquer large territories overnight. Instead, Osman moved with deliberate slowness. He focused on securing one valley before moving to the next, stabilizing one village before approaching the following one. This incremental approach created a unique sense of continuity. Imagine Osman sitting by a small hearth during a winter night, quietly listening to his advisors discuss matters of land distribution, alliances, and the needs of the growing population. Outside, snow covers the hills with a soft blanket. The camp is quiet except for the occasional crackle of burning wood. In such moments, Osman's plans for expansion likely took shape not through sudden inspiration, but through long contemplation and measured consideration. This is the essence of early Ottoman growth: slow, thoughtful, grounded in necessity rather than ambition. The first major target, Karacahisar. Among the small Byzantine strongholds in the frontier region, Karacahisar Castle held symbolic importance. Perched on a hill near the town of Eskişehir, it controlled local trade and served as a garrison for Byzantine troops. Taking the castle was not merely a military achievement, it would legitimize Osman's authority in the eyes of both his followers and his rivals. The siege of Karacahisar, according to Ottoman tradition, was not a grand or violent confrontation. It was likely a quiet, drawn-out affair, involving small tactical engagements, negotiations, and persistent pressure. When the castle finally fell into Osman's hands, it marked the first significant territorial acquisition of the Ottoman Beylik. The event was modest at the time, but it planted a seed of confidence that would eventually blossom into empire-building momentum. After capturing the castle, Osman appointed a judge, Cudi, and officials to administer the region. This might seem like a technical detail, but it was profound. Osman was not simply conquering territory, he was establishing a system. A sense of governance replaced the chaos of the frontier. People living in nearby settlements now had a court to resolve disputes, a tax structure to follow, and the protection of a rapidly growing principality. The capture of Karacahisar also elevated Osman's status among the other Turkic beys. His influence was no longer confined to his immediate tribe. He was becoming a regional actor. The Dream of Osman. One of the most famous symbolic stories from this period is Osman's dream. Whether historically accurate or not, the tale reflects how later generations understood Osman's destiny. In the dream, a moon emerges from the chest of a holy man and settles into Osman's chest. A great tree then grows from him, stretching its branches across continents. The imagery is gentle, almost meditative. A moon descending softly, a tree growing slowly, this aligns perfectly with the tone of early Ottoman history. Nothing happens abruptly. Even the dream of empire is portrayed as something organic, rooted, unfolding over time with natural ease. The gradual shift from tribe to state. With each small victory, Osman's principality evolved. The tribal council became a more structured governing body. The small raiding parties transformed into a disciplined fighting force. Taxes became more systematic. Villages became towns. The population grew. What had started as a mobile, flexible nomadic group was turning into a settled state with long-term aims. And still, this transformation remained quiet. There were no triumphant celebrations, no proclamations of greatness. Life continued peacefully for most people. Farmers planted crops, herders guided their flocks across the plains, and local markets hummed with modest activity. The expansion was felt more as a gentle widening of stability than as a dramatic conquest. A frontier that welcomed many. An interesting feature of the early Ottoman world is the way it absorbed diverse groups of people. Turkmen warriors seeking a leader, Christian peasants seeking protection, dervishes searching for spiritual refuge, craftsmen and traders looking for opportunities, all flowed naturally into Osman's domain. The Ottomans did not force uniformity, rather, they created a flexible social fabric that allowed different communities to coexist. This adaptability became one of the empire's enduring strengths. Toward a new era. By the early 14th century, Osman was no longer simply the leader of a tribe. He was the ruler of a principality with its own identity, stability, and expanding borders. Yet the empire that would one day encompass vast territories was still only a faint outline in the distance, like a distant mountain barely visible through the haze of an early dawn. Osman's rule, shaped by patience and quiet determination, laid the foundation for everything that would follow. But the next stage of the story, the era of his son, Orhan, would push the Ottomans beyond their frontier roots and introduce the world to a rising power that could no longer be overlooked. The peaceful transition to Orhan and the gentle rise of a growing state. As the soft glow of dawn gradually brightened the plains around Sagat, a quiet transition was taking place within the Ottoman Beylik. Osman, now older and carrying the weight of decades spent guiding his people through uncertainty, slowly stepped back from active leadership. Time had worn his body, but not his gentle resolve. His son Orhan, calm by nature and steady in character, began to assume greater responsibilities. There was no dramatic ceremony, no resounding proclamation. The shift was as smooth as the slow turning of seasons. The early 14th century in Anatolia felt like a long exhale after centuries of turbulence. The Mongol threat had receded somewhat, the Byzantine Empire remained weak, other Turkic principalities continued their internal struggles. Within this landscape, the Ottomans, still modest in size, were finding their rhythm. Their expansion was neither violent nor hurried, it was measured, deliberate, guided by a sense of quiet purpose. Orhan, a leader formed by stability. Orhan, unlike his father, did not grow up in a world of constant migration. His childhood was shaped by settled life, by the hum of growing markets, by the presence of administrators in newly captured towns, and by the steady expansion of cultivated land. He was, in a sense, the first Ottoman leader raised in an environment that resembled a state more than a wandering tribe. People who met Orhan often described him as calm, patient, and thoughtful. He was not a fiery orator. He did not rush into battle seeking personal glory. He moved with quiet certainty, preferring careful planning over bold impulsiveness. Under his guidance, the Ottoman Beylik entered a phase of structured growth. Where Osman had laid the foundation, Orhan began to build the walls, still slowly, still carefully, but with a sense of direction shaped by the needs of a rising principality. The capture of Bursa, a turning point without noise. Among Orhan's earliest significant achievements was the capture of Bursa in 1326. Later historians would describe the event as a milestone, the moment the Ottomans gained their first major city. Yet in reality, the conquest was a long, patient process rather than a single decisive battle. For years, Ottoman forces had surrounded Bursa, gradually cutting off its supplies. There were skirmishes, negotiations, moments of tension, but nothing resembling the dramatic storming of a city. The siege was slow, predictable, almost uneventful. When the Byzantines finally surrendered, it was due not to military collapse but to the simple exhaustion of resources. Bursa fell gently, not violently. Once the city came under Ottoman control, Orhan did something characteristic of his temperament. He focused not on celebration, but on organization. He appointed administrators, ensured the safety of residents, and encouraged craftsmen, farmers, and merchants to settle. Bursa began to flourish quietly, becoming a center of trade, production, learning, and spiritual life. Soon, it would serve as the first true capital of the Ottoman state. A stable administration takes shape. Under Orhan, the Ottomans began to develop administrative structures that would later define the empire. These were not created in haste. They emerged gradually, through practical needs and careful trial and error. One of the earliest innovations was the minting of Ottoman coins. The simple act of producing currency marked a profound shift. The Beylik was no longer merely a local power, it was becoming a sovereign state with economic autonomy. Orhan also established a standing army, known as the Yaya infantry. These soldiers were paid salaries, another sign of a stable administrative system. Later, a second group known as the Muzellim cavalry was formed. Though still rudimentary compared to later Ottoman military institutions, these early units laid the groundwork for the disciplined forces that would one day conquer cities like Constantinople. But perhaps the most important development was the increasingly organized system of governance. Judges were appointed to towns. Taxation became more regular. Territory was divided into manageable districts. These changes happened slowly, carefully, each adjustment aimed at making life more predictable for the population. The Ottomans were creating not just a military power, but a functioning society. The marriage alliance with the Byzantine Empire. In a surprising moment that demonstrates just how fluid the frontier world was, Orhan married Theodora, the daughter of Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene. This happened decades before the Ottomans became a major threat to Byzantium, at a time when political alliances were practical necessities rather than symbolic gestures. Their marriage was not the result of romance or courtly tradition. It was a political agreement, calm, rational, mutually beneficial. The Byzantines needed support in their internal struggles, and the Ottomans saw an opportunity to strengthen ties and gain legitimacy. The marriage also illustrates something essential about the early Ottoman mindset: flexibility. Rather than defining themselves rigidly against their neighbors, the Ottomans engaged with them pragmatically. They formed alliances, offered military assistance, and participated in the complex web of frontier diplomacy. This adaptability would later become one of their greatest strengths. The first expansion into Europe. One of the most significant developments of Orhan's era was the Ottoman presence in Thrace, marking the beginning of expansion into Europe. Yet even this monumental step happened quietly. In the 1350s, Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha crossed the Dardanelles with a small group of troops. They did not invade with a massive army. Instead, they took advantage of a political vacuum left by Byzantium's internal struggles and the destructive effects of an earthquake that had damaged local fortresses. The Ottomans secured a foothold at Simp Castle. This moment, modest at the time, would eventually open the gate to centuries of Ottoman presence in Europe. But in its own time, it passed with little fanfare. It was simply another step in a long, gradual process of expansion. Suleiman Pasha, a quiet yet pivotal figure. Suleiman Pasha, Orhan's eldest son, was instrumental in early Ottoman expansion into Thrace. He was disciplined, strategic, and patient, traits that mirrored the style of both his father and grandfather. Suleiman strengthened Ottoman positions in Gallipoli and secured small towns and fortresses across the region. His death, caused by a fall from a horse in 1357, was a quiet tragedy. There was no heroic battle, no dramatic sacrifice, just a simple accident that deprived the Ottomans of a skilled leader. Orhan reportedly mourned deeply, retreating into seclusion for a time. The Ottoman state matures slowly. By the time of Orhan's later years, the Ottoman Principality had transformed into a genuine state. The Beylik now controlled important cities, Bursa, Iznik, and parts of Thrace. The economy was growing. The population was increasing. The army, though still small, was professional and disciplined. The administrative structure was becoming more defined. Yet the growth remained steady rather than explosive. The Ottomans were not yet the dominant power of the region. They were still one principality among many. Their future greatness was only faintly visible. Orhan's final years. As Orhan aged, he lived much like his father had, peacefully, thoughtfully, surrounded by advisors and family. He watched as his sons took on responsibilities and as the Ottoman lands took their early shape. His rule, lasting for decades, was marked not by dramatic upheaval but by calm consolidation. The Ottomans under Orhan did not burn brightly. They glowed steadily. He passed away quietly, leaving behind a principality far stronger than the one he inherited. But the real transformation, the leap from regional power to major empire, would occur under his son, Murad I. The next chapter of the Ottoman story would bring deeper structure, wider expansion, and the first major steps toward empire, all still within the same slow, methodical, understated rhythm that defined the Ottoman rise. Murad I and the soft expansion into the Balkans. The rise of Murad I marked an important turning point in Ottoman history, yet his ascent to power did not come with loud proclamations or sudden political upheaval. Instead, like so many developments in the early Ottoman world, it unfolded quietly. Orhan's long rule had given the Beylik stability, and the transition to Murad felt like another smooth and natural shift, similar to how dawn gradually overtakes the night sky without a clear dividing line. Murad inherited a principality that was expanding in both Anatolia and Thrace, and though the challenges ahead were significant, he approached them with the same calm, methodical patience that had defined his predecessors. His temperament was steady, thoughtful, and composed. He was not known for fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, he governed with a quiet firmness, building slowly upon the foundation left to him. A leader emerging in a changing time. Murad came to power in 1362, a moment when the political landscape surrounding the Ottomans was shifting. The Byzantine Empire, once a dominating force, continued its slow decline. Internal conflicts weakened it further, leaving many of its European territories vulnerable. In the Balkans, various principalities, Serbia, Bulgaria, Wallachia, were locked in cycles of alliances, rivalries, and disputes. None possessed the unity or strength to form a consistent defense against outside forces. This fragmented environment created opportunities for expansion. But Murad did not rush. Instead, he advanced carefully, securing each newly gained region by establishing administrative structures, placing trusted officials in key positions, and ensuring that the local population experienced minimal disturbance. His strategy relied less on overwhelming force and more on gradual consolidation. The capital moves to Edirne. One of Murad's most consequential but understated decisions was moving the Ottoman capital from Bursa to Edirne. This move did not signal a rejection of Anatolia, but rather an embrace of the Beylik's new reality. The Ottomans were no longer just an Anatolian principality, they were now a Balkan power as well. Edirne, located deep in Thrace, was a city of strategic importance and cultural depth. Originally known as Adrianople, it had long served as a military and administrative center for the Byzantines. Its roads connected Europe and Anatolia, its fertile lands supported growing populations. When the Ottomans took control of Edirne in the early 1360s, it was not through a dramatic siege but a gradual shift in influence and military advantage. Once in Ottoman hands, Murad invested time and resources into stabilizing the city, repairing structures, and establishing it as a central hub of governance. The choice to elevate Edirne as the new capital reflected Murad's quiet but clear vision. It symbolized a commitment to expansion in Europe, not in a boastful, triumphant way, but with the steady assurance of a state preparing for long-term presence. Administrative growth and the early Devshirme system. Under Murad's leadership, the administrative system of the Ottoman state grew more complex. The population was increasing, the territory was expanding, and the state's needs were becoming more sophisticated. To maintain order, Murad strengthened the system of timars, land grants given in exchange for military service, allowing a larger cavalry force to be supported without imposing heavy burdens on the treasury. It was also during Murad's reign that the earliest forms of the Devshirme system began to appear. This system would later become central to Ottoman administration, but in Murad's time it was still small-scale and experimental. Children from certain Christian families in the Balkans were recruited to be trained as soldiers and administrators. They were educated carefully, converted to Islam, and given opportunities for social mobility that did not exist in their original communities. Over time, this process produced the famous Janissary Corps, though the full system would not mature until later reigns. At this early stage, the developing Devshirme system was not widely known or understood. It was a quiet innovation, a subtle shaping of an institution that would one day become emblematic of Ottoman military and political power. The peaceful integration of Balkan territories. As Ottoman forces advanced deeper into the Balkans, their approach remained consistent, patient, steady, and organized. Some towns and villages were taken through small skirmishes or negotiated surrender. Others joined the Ottoman sphere voluntarily, seeing the Ottomans as preferable to local rivals. Life for the average person in these regions changed slowly. Farmers continued their work. Villagers continued their routines. Religious life remained largely undisturbed. Taxes were reorganized, but often they were more predictable than before. In many cases, the Ottomans allowed local customs to continue, integrating their own systems gently into the existing social fabric. Murad's administrators were careful to maintain order. If a town was captured, they quickly appointed judges, tax collectors, and officials to stabilize it. Roads were maintained, trade routes protected, and agricultural lands surveyed. The Ottomans understood that expansion was meaningless unless territory could be held, governed, and made productive. The Battle of Maritsa, a quiet turning point. In 1371, the Battle of Maritsa became a defining moment in Ottoman expansion into the Balkans. Yet, in many ways, it was typical of the understated nature of early Ottoman victories. A coalition of Serbian lords, seeking to halt Ottoman advance, assembled an army. But their attack came at a moment of weakness. They were disorganized, overconfident, and unprepared for the Ottoman strategy. The Ottoman forces, likely smaller in number, launched a surprise attack during the night, causing panic and confusion. The result was decisive, but the scale of the battle was relatively small compared to later conflicts. Still, the consequences were profound. After Maritsa, many Balkan rulers accepted Ottoman overlordship. Some paid tribute, others promised military assistance. The Ottomans did not force their culture or religion upon them. They simply incorporated them into the growing network of allies and vassals. Maritsa did not feel like a grand conquest. It felt more like the quiet solidification of Ottoman presence, another step in a slow, deliberate path. Murad's leadership style. Murad's personality played a vital role in shaping the early empire. He was not extravagant. He did not build monumental structures or declare sweeping reforms. His decisions were thoughtful, often conservative, and always aimed at steady growth rather than sudden transformation. Contemporary accounts describe him as calm and composed. He preferred dialogue to confrontation when possible. His court was organized but not overly luxurious. Scholars and administrators appreciated his stability. Murad often spent time traveling through newly acquired territories, listening to local leaders, discussing administrative matters, and ensuring that governance remained smooth. His presence was reassuring rather than imposing. People saw him as a steady hand guiding the state through a period of expansion. The Balkans begin to shift. By the late 1370s, the political map of the Balkans looked noticeably different. Ottoman influence stretched across wide areas. Some states had become direct territories. Others remained semi-independent but acknowledged Ottoman authority. Still others formed alliances out of necessity. The Ottomans did not push for rapid domination. They allowed the Balkan world to adjust gradually. Stability mattered more than speed. Integration mattered more than conquest. This slow and careful approach helped the Ottomans avoid overextension. Each new region was absorbed gently, with minimal disruption. Administrative systems expanded to support the growing state, and the transition from principality to regional power continued with steady momentum. Toward the reign of Bayezid I. As Murad entered his later years, the Ottoman state was stronger, more organized, and more confident than ever before. The Beylik had evolved into a true regional power, one deeply rooted in both Anatolia and the Balkans. Murad's gentle but firm guidance had shaped the empire's character, giving it resilience and flexibility. Yet the next chapter would bring a very different style of leadership. Murad's son, Bayezid, later known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, would lead the empire with unprecedented speed, ambition, and intensity. The calm rise of the Ottomans under Murad would soon give way to a more dramatic, rapid, and assertive era. But everything Bayezid achieved would rest on the quiet foundation laid by his father. The quiet rise of Murad I and the deepening roots of an empire. As the Ottoman Principality drifted from the era of Orhan Gazi into the long, deliberate reign of Murad I, history once again seemed to slow its beating pace. The mid-14th century was a period in which many powers of the region stirred restlessly, but the Ottoman world moved with a strange calmness, almost like a river whose surface appears still while powerful currents flow beneath. This was the atmosphere in which Murad, son of Orhan and grandson of Osman, slowly built the foundations of what was no longer merely a frontier beylik but the early shape of an imperial structure. Murad I, also known as Hugh de Vendigar, did not assume the throne amid fanfare or dramatic declarations. His accession felt like the natural continuation of a path already carved out by his father and grandfather. The transition from Orhan to Murad occurred with the gentle inevitability of evening turning into night. Nothing explosive, nothing sudden, but steady, predictable, and yet quietly transformative. Murad inherited not only lands but also a sense of responsibility layered with the weight of expanding borders, diverse populations, and the subtle need for administrative evolution. By the time Murad rose to power, the Ottomans had already made their first steps into Europe, establishing a presence in Thrace. This presence began as a frontier outpost, then a foothold, and eventually a pattern. European observers of the time often underestimated the Ottomans, interpreting them as just another transient group of frontier warriors. But Murad I understood, perhaps better than almost any of his predecessors, that permanence required more than conquest. It required structure, continuity, and institution. One of Murad's earliest and most influential measures was the creation of a more formal administrative hierarchy. The empire to be was no longer a collection of tribal groups gathered under a charismatic leader. It was becoming a system. Murad oversaw the development of provincial governorships, timar assignments, and early bureaucracy. These systems were perhaps simple by later standards, but in the 14th century Balkan world, they provided a rare consistency. And that consistency is part of why the Ottomans expanded not in bursts but in long, stable stretches. Under Murad's leadership, the capital moved from Bursa to Edirne, then known as Adrianople, a shift that symbolized the changing focus of the empire. The story of Edirne becoming an Ottoman capital is not filled with dramatic episodes. It happened gradually, through necessity more than ambition. Edirne sat at the heart of the Balkans, a crossroads of rivers, roads, and cultures. Establishing it as the new center of power meant that the Ottoman presence in Europe would no longer be temporary. Murad's empire now looked westward as much as it looked east. During these years, the Ottoman armies continued their expansions, slow, measured, rhythmical. Battles were fought, territories were taken, fortresses were surrendered, but the overall impression is one of steady motion rather than chaotic conflict. The Battle of Maritsa in 1371, for example, was a decisive moment, yet the chroniclers often describe it with a kind of eerie stillness. A small Ottoman force defeated a larger Balkan coalition during a night attack, and the shockwaves of that event echoed throughout southeastern Europe. But for the Ottomans, it simply reinforced something they already sensed: their rise was inevitable. While military encounters shaped the borders, Murad's administrative decisions shaped the empire's character. It was during his reign that the Janissary Corps Kokuktiv Serm system's earliest form began to take shape as a structured, disciplined force distinct from tribal contingents. The Janissaries did not yet hold the full political influence they would wield in later centuries, but even in their early form, they introduced a sense of order and professionalism. These soldiers, taken from non-Muslim families and raised within the Ottoman system, created a unique bond to the state, one that was not based on lineage, tribe, or noble class, but on service. Murad's era also strengthened the practice of integrating conquered populations with care. Local rulers were often left in place, taxes collected with predictable systems, and religious communities granted a level of autonomy uncommon in medieval polities. This practical tolerance was not the product of lofty ideals but of administrative necessity. Managing a diverse empire required the quiet acceptance that not every region could be reshaped into a single model. And so the Ottomans learned the art of governing differently in different places, a flexible approach that would eventually become one of their greatest strengths. One of the most fascinating but understated aspects of Murad's rule is the tone of the chronicles. While later Ottoman emperors are often portrayed in energetic narratives filled with dramatic battles or architectural achievements, Murad I is described in calm, measured language. He appears as a figure who preferred order over spectacle, stability over glory, system over sudden expansion. Even his personality is often depicted in a subdued way, consistent with the broader atmosphere of the early Ottoman state, where identity was shaped not by kingship grandeur but by frontier pragmatism. While the empire grew, Murad himself spent many years moving slowly between regions: Thrace, Macedonia, Rumelia, and occasionally Anatolia, ensuring loyalty, settling disputes, and maintaining presence. Rulers of the time often maintained authority through distance and grandeur, but Murad did so through physical presence and quiet persistence. His movements were not triumphant processions but deliberate checks on the stability of the realm. The late years of Murad's reign were overshadowed by increasing concerns from European coalitions. The Balkan principalities, sensing the expanding reach of the Ottoman state, began to form alliances aimed at halting it. Yet these alliances, often weakened by internal rivalries, could not match the disciplined and coordinated nature of Murad's forces. The seeds of the later Battle of Kosovo were planted in this atmosphere of growing tension. Yet even here, in the build-up to one of medieval Europe's most famous confrontations, the Ottoman perspective remained surprisingly restrained. For Murad, Kosovo was not an attempt at total domination but another step in the long consolidation of Rumelia. The battle, which would ultimately claim Murad's life, unfolded within a narrative filled not with fury but with solemnity, a fitting reflection of his rule. As the empire slowly approached the twilight of Murad's reign, one senses a remarkable stillness. The foundations were strong, the administrative structure expanding, and the European territories increasingly integrated. Nothing dramatic marked each passing year, yet everything was changing beneath the surface. Murad I's legacy is not one of spectacular transformation but of steady formation. He turned a principality into an organized state, a frontier beylik into a transcontinental power.
His calm, deliberate rule created the framework that allowed his successors, most notably Bayezid I and later Mehmed II, to expand with confidence.
In this sense, Murad's era feels like a long exhale in the story of the Ottoman Empire, quiet, stable, and foundational. A peaceful rhythm before the more dramatic movements that history would soon compose. Bayezid I, the quiet intensity before the storm. When Murad I's long, steady reign came to its sullen close on the fields of Kosovo, the Ottoman state did not erupt into sudden confusion or panic. Instead, the transition to his son, Bayezid I, later known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, unfolded with an unexpected softness. Despite the fierce title that would later define him, Bayezid's early ascension carried a tone of controlled calmness, as though the empire was collectively inhaling before the tempo of history subtly accelerated. Bayezid I was not a ruler of theatrics or grandiose proclamations. Even the stories of his swift military maneuvers, which earned him his famous nickname, often feel muted when read through the lens of the chroniclers of the time. Their writings portray him as a man of quick decision, yes, but also of deep contemplation. His silence, they suggest, carried as much weight as his speed. The Ottoman Empire under Bayezid therefore developed along two intertwined lines, the increasingly fast rhythm of military expansion and the steady, quiet pulse of administrative consolidation. At the dawn of his rule, Bayezid inherited an empire that stretched across both Anatolia and the Balkans. This dual nature of the realm meant that the new sultan had to divide his attention between two continents, two sets of political actors, and two complex webs of cultural, religious, and social relationships. Yet Bayezid rarely seemed overwhelmed. Instead, he approached this duality with a kind of serene determination, as if he recognized that the empire was fated to span these regions and required only his careful hand to guide it.
In Rumelia, the Balkan territories continued to expand, not through chaotic conquest, but through a persistent, almost rhythmic advance.
Local principalities, already weakened by internal divisions, found themselves integrated into the Ottoman structure one by one. Some joined peacefully, others resisted briefly, and a few held out longer than expected. But the overall motion was slow, steady, and inevitable, like a tide moving in. Bayezid's forces moved in patterns that suggested both speed and deliberation. His campaigns in Bulgaria and Macedonia, though often described as decisive, still maintain an air of calm inevitability when viewed through the large narrative. There were battles, yes, but these engagements rarely involved dramatic reversals or shocking surprises. They were the natural continuation of policies set in motion long before Bayezid took the throne. Perhaps the most symbolic of Bayezid's Balkan efforts was the growing integration of Serbia into Ottoman political life. The Serbian despotates, fractured by earlier conflicts and the aftermath of Kosovo, entered into vassalage arrangements with Bayezid that were defined not by chaos but by detailed agreements, mutual obligations, and a tone of pragmatic coexistence. Even in the midst of expanding borders, Bayezid's governance carried a surprisingly administrative texture. However, the bond between Bayezid I and Serbia held a deeply personal dimension as well, his close alliance with and marriage to Despina Hatun, the daughter of the Serbian prince. This relationship served as a symbol of the empire's ability to blend personal diplomacy with political expansion. Chroniclers often speak of Despina's presence at Bayezid's court not with passion or drama, but with an understated respect, reflecting the wider Ottoman approach to integrating Balkan elites into the evolving imperial structure.
Meanwhile, across the Anatolian plateau, the tempo of Bayezid's rule subtly shifted. The Turkish beyliks, which had grown semi-independent during previous decades, began to sense Bayezid's firm interest in unifying Anatolia under a single authority.
the Sultan approached this task with unusual resolve. Beylik after Beylik fell under his influence. Karaman, Aydin, Saruhan, Mentees, Germian, each through a combination of diplomatic pressure, familial ties, and military action. Yet even these events, which later historians frame as major turning points, felt curiously quiet in their unfolding. There were no massive civil wars, no sweeping betrayals, no sudden collapses. Instead, the unification of Anatolia progressed as if Bayezid were simply straightening the edges of a map that had long been meant to fit together. The city of Bursa, meanwhile, remained a deeply symbolic center of Bayezid's rule. Although Edirne was the political heart of the empire in Europe, Bursa preserved a sense of spiritual continuity. It was here that Bayezid commissioned mosques, madrises, imarets, and architectural works that echoed the style of his predecessors but added a slight touch of grandeur. Not the dramatic architectural revolution that would come in later centuries, but the early signs of refinement: shaded courtyards, harmonious arches, balanced spaces meant for prayer, reflection, and learning.
Among these works, the most famous would be the foundations laid for what would become the Ulu Cami, a structure that represented both Bayezid's devotion and the empire's growing confidence.
Even in this architectural endeavor, the narrative remains calm and restrained, more about continuity than innovation. But while Bayezid moved with quiet efficiency across his territories, the wider world began to shift in a way that would eventually disrupt his calm. Far to the east, a new power was rising, one that moved with the chaotic energy that the Ottoman chroniclers never attributed to their own state. This was the realm of Timur, known in Europe as Tamerlane, a conqueror whose campaigns carried the violence of a storm rather than the patient advance of a tide. At first, Timur's movements seemed remote from Bayezid's concerns. The Anatolian beyliks he absorbed had previously maintained their own contacts with Timur. Some fled to him for protection as Bayezid pressed his unification efforts. Others attempted to play both sides, hoping to survive between two powerful rulers. The atmosphere grew tense, not dramatically yet, but like the distant echo of thunder on a still afternoon. Meanwhile, in Europe, the swelling anxiety toward Ottoman expansion crystallized into the Crusade of Nicopolis. This crusade, composed of Hungarian, French, Wallachian, German, and other European forces, represented one of the most organized attempts to halt the empire's rise. And yet, even this grand coalition unfolded with a kind of predictable rhythm. The Crusaders, confident and energetic, advanced southward. Bayezid responded quickly but not rashly. The battle that followed, though intense, carried the tone of inevitability that had marked so many Ottoman military encounters. The victory at Nicopolis was decisive, but Bayezid did not celebrate with loud proclamations. Instead, the chronicles speak of him returning to his responsibilities with the same quiet intensity that characterized his entire rule. Nicopolis, in Bayezid's eyes, was not the climax of an era but another step in the empire's carefully unfolding path. Yet even with such victories, the horizon darkened. Timur's armies pushed westward, and envoys carried words laced with challenge. The tension between the two rulers grew in a slow, steady escalation, like a long march toward a distant but unavoidable confrontation. Bayezid's final years were thus marked by a strange mixture of confidence and encroaching unease. The empire had reached unprecedented heights, stretching across two continents with remarkable stability. And yet, the quiet rhythm of Ottoman expansion was about to collide with a force defined by rapid, destructive momentum. The stage was set for the Battle of Ankara, a moment that would disrupt the calm narrative of the early Ottoman state and reshape the empire's trajectory. But for now, in the late sunlight of Bayezid's reign, the atmosphere still feels slow, reflective, and steady. The empire stands tall, its borders wide, its institutions expanding, its ruler contemplative even as storms gather far away. The calm before the tempest remains one of the most fascinating periods in Ottoman history, precisely because it moves so quietly toward one of the most dramatic turning points the empire would ever face. The Battle of Ankara and the Interregnum, a quiet storm. The early 15th century arrived upon the Ottoman world not with a sudden, explosive announcement, but with the steady accumulation of tension that had been building over decades. Bayezid I, the thunderbolt, whose calm decisiveness had guided the empire through Europe and Anatolia, now faced a challenge that would test the very foundations of his realm. It was a challenge unlike any he had encountered, not merely another frontier or principality, but a distant, powerful, and unpredictable force, Timur, also known as Tamerlane. Timur's campaigns had advanced steadily from Central Asia into Persia and Mesopotamia, leaving a trail of disruption in their wake. While the Ottomans had grown slowly, carefully, and deliberately, Timur's empire expanded with sudden speed, unexpected maneuvers, and fierce destruction. From a distance, the Ottoman court observed the rising threat with measured concern. Diplomats were dispatched. Messages exchanged. Envoys moved quietly across deserts, rivers, and mountains, carrying words meant to delay, negotiate, or subtly influence. Bayezid understood that this was not a foe to confront with sheer courage alone. Timur's reputation for overwhelming force, meticulous strategy, and swift campaigns demanded careful planning. Bayezid prepared his forces with the same calm, deliberate care that had marked his entire reign. Recruitment, logistics, and positioning of troops were all considered with patient attention, leaving nothing to chance. Unlike the frontier skirmishes of earlier decades, this conflict required precision, coordination, and foresight. By 1402, the two forces finally converged near Ankara. The Ottoman army, a disciplined and experienced force, stretched across the plains, organized into formations that reflected decades of evolving military practice. Bayezid's leadership had ensured the cohesion of his army, blending Timur cavalry, infantry, and auxiliary forces into a unified whole. Each contingent knew its place, each commander its duty. The organization reflected not only military necessity but the methodical patience that defined the Ottoman rise. Timur's army, by contrast, moved with striking unpredictability. The Central Asian war machine, composed of cavalry accustomed to sudden maneuvers and rapid redeployments, pressed forward in ways that tested the limits of Ottoman preparation. Still, Bayezid maintained a calm exterior. There were no panicked adjustments, no hasty redeployments. Each movement was deliberate, each command measured. The battle itself unfolded in a manner that, while violent, lacked the theatricality of later medieval battles. Soldiers faced each other on the plain, formations clashed, and arrows flew silently against the horizon. Bayezid's forces fought with discipline, attempting to hold line after line, while Timur's cavalry circled, pressured, and adjusted. For hours, the encounter progressed almost like a slow-moving storm, tension rising, energy building, but without sudden peaks or dramatic explosions. Ultimately, however, the combination of Timur's tactical maneuvers, numerical advantages, and occasional defection among Ottoman vassals led to a collapse of Ottoman cohesion. Bayezid was captured, an extraordinary event for a reigning sultan, yet one that occurred in the quiet, inevitable rhythm that seems to characterize early Ottoman chronicles. He was taken into Timur's custody, marking a temporary halt to Ottoman momentum. Bayezid's captivity lasted for several months, and while contemporary accounts sometimes dramatize the psychological impact, the larger narrative emphasizes the solemnity and inevitability of the event rather than theatrical suffering. Bayezid died in captivity, and the empire he had built with careful patience faced a new challenge: survival in the absence of central authority. This period, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, lasted from 1402 to 1413. Unlike conventional chaos described in other historical upheavals, the interregnum was a prolonged, slow-moving period in which Bayezid's sons Isa, Musa, Mehmed, and Suleiman divided the empire among themselves. Each son ruled a different portion, exercising authority over regions that had been connected under Bayezid. Yet the transition was gradual. There were no instant collapses of cities, no sudden abandonment of towns, and no immediate collapse of administration. Life for the average person continued, largely unchanged in day-to-day activities. This decentralization carried both risks and opportunities. On the one hand, rivalries among Bayezid's sons led to small-scale battles, diplomatic negotiation, and shifting alliances. On the other hand, the regions maintained continuity, tax collection persisted, local administration remained intact, and trade continued along established routes. The Ottoman Interregnum demonstrates how resilient the system had become, even when central authority was temporarily absent. Stability, it seems, had been embedded into the empire's very structure. During these years, Mehmed Chalebi, later Mehmed I, gradually consolidated power. Through a combination of diplomacy, patience, and selective military campaigns, he reunited the fragmented territories. This reunification did not happen suddenly. It took years of careful negotiation, small victories, and patient integration. Mehmed I's success was less about sudden conquest and more about restoring cohesion to a system already built on slow, deliberate growth. While historians often emphasize the dramatic symbolism of the interregnum, the daily reality was far more subdued. Farmers continued their planting and harvesting cycles. Merchants traveled the same roads they had for decades. Religious institutions functioned normally. The Ottoman state persisted in a muted, methodical fashion. Even the battles fought during this period carried the tone of inevitability, rather than explosive unpredictability. Mehmed I's eventual consolidation laid the foundation for future expansion. By 1413, the Ottoman Empire had emerged from the interregnum largely intact, with a renewed sense of purpose and stability. The lessons of the era were clear: even temporary disruptions did not destroy the system. Patience, careful administration, and incremental integration ensured the continuity of the Ottoman state. Thus, the interregnum, while dramatic in terms of leadership, was characterized by slow, steady resilience. The empire, tempered by challenges, emerged more robust and methodically organized, ready to resume the quiet rhythm of expansion that had defined the earlier centuries. The Battle of Ankara and the interregnum represent, in the larger narrative, the gentle persistence of an empire that could withstand shocks not through sudden brilliance alone, but through carefully cultivated administrative depth and patient integration. The story of these years, though quiet and understated, exemplifies the Ottoman method: steady, deliberate, and surprisingly resilient. Mehmed I and the gentle restoration of the Ottoman state. The early years of the 15th century found the Ottoman Empire in a state of quiet recuperation. Following the turbulence of the Battle of Ankara and the interregnum, the empire had endured a period of fragmentation and uncertainty. Yet out of this moment arose Mehmed I, a sultan whose rule would not be marked by sudden conquests or dramatic displays, but by the steady, patient restoration of the state his predecessors had so carefully nurtured. Mehmed's reign illustrates a different kind of strength, less about explosive power and more about calm, methodical governance that allowed the Ottoman Empire to regain stability.
Mehmed I ascended the throne in 1413, after nearly a decade of rivalries among Bayezid's sons.
These years had left the empire fractured, but not destroyed. Each regional ruler continued day-to-day governance, maintained trade routes, and collected taxes. The administrative framework established during the reigns of Osman, Orhan, and Bayezid had proven resilient. Mehmed inherited not chaos, but a loosely unified system that required careful guidance to knit back together.
Gradual consolidation.
Mehmed's strategy was simple but effective. He pursued gradual, patient reunification of the Ottoman lands. Rather than seeking to annihilate rivals in dramatic battles, he often relied on negotiation, diplomacy, and incremental victories.
When conflict became necessary, it was conducted with planning and restraint.
Mehmed understood that the empire's cohesion depended on the loyalty of its regional governors, local elites, and vassal states. During his reign, Mehmed carefully balanced the interests of Anatolia and Rumelia. Anatolia, previously the heartland of the Beylik, was crucial for sustaining agricultural production and maintaining the loyalty of local Turkish tribes. Rumelia, the Ottoman territories in the Balkans, was expanding steadily into European lands. Mehmed's task was to ensure that neither region felt neglected and that the empire remained a coherent, functioning entity. This careful attention to administrative balance allowed the Ottomans to stabilize without resorting to rapid, disruptive expansion.
Administrative reforms and the early bureaucracy. One of Mehmed I's notable contributions was the strengthening of the administrative system. Governors were appointed with careful consideration, ensuring that each province was managed effectively. Local customs were often respected, reducing resistance to central authority. Taxation became more systematic, and mechanisms for dispute resolution were reinforced. These measures may seem mundane, yet they were vital for the empire's long-term stability. In addition, Mehmed continued to develop the Immerse system, a land-based reward system that supported cavalry units in exchange for military service. By expanding and refining this system, Mehmed ensured a loyal and organized military presence across the empire. These forces were disciplined, well-provisioned, and strategically deployed, laying the groundwork for future campaigns.
The Janissaries, though still a relatively small force, continued to gain prominence under Mehmed's rule. The Devshirme system, by which Christian youths were recruited, educated, and trained as soldiers and administrators, expanded incrementally. These young men, fully integrated into Ottoman institutions, became an essential part of the Sultan's capacity to enforce authority and maintain order.
Diplomacy and regional relations. Mehmed I understood the importance of diplomacy alongside military strategy.
The Balkans remained fragmented, with Serbian, Bulgarian, and Wallachian principalities often shifting alliances. Mehmed engaged with these rulers through treaties, marriages, and vassal arrangements. Integration of local elites into Ottoman governance became a hallmark of his policy. By offering relative autonomy while maintaining oversight, Mehmed minimized resistance and ensured loyalty. In Anatolia, Mehmed sought to bring remaining independent beyliks under centralized control. His approach was incremental. Instead of immediate annexation, Mehmed often offered incentives, negotiated marriages, or leveraged alliances to extend influence. This steady, careful approach reduced the risk of prolonged conflicts and internal disruption. The calm expansion of territory. Under Mehmed I, Ottoman expansion was neither rapid nor theatrical. Instead, it progressed in measured steps. New towns and fortresses were absorbed gradually. Border regions were stabilized before further expansion was attempted. Even military campaigns, though effective, were conducted with patience, ensuring that conquered territories could be integrated into the administrative system. The quiet nature of these expansions helped the empire endure periods of potential instability. By consolidating control over existing territories before seeking new lands, Mehmed reinforced the foundations laid by his grandfather Osman, his father Orhan, and his uncle Bayezid. This patient method of governance became a defining characteristic of the early Ottoman state. Cultural and religious continuity. Mehmed I also placed importance on maintaining cultural and religious continuity across the empire. Mosques, madrasas, and charitable institutions were supported and expanded. These establishments reinforced social cohesion and integrated newly acquired populations into Ottoman structures. Mehmed understood that an empire was more than armies and borders, it was also the rhythm of daily life, the reliability of institutions, and the sense of shared identity fostered over decades of careful governance. Bursa, Edirne, and other major cities retained their significance as centers of administration, commerce, and religious life. Mehmed ensured that these urban centers functioned smoothly, with markets active, roads maintained, and communities regulated. Life moved steadily, predictably, and with the sense of continuity that had always characterized Ottoman growth. The legacy of Mehmed I. By the time of Mehmed I's death in 1421, the Ottoman Empire had emerged from the interregnum as a cohesive and functioning state. While he may not have achieved the dramatic victories or expansive conquests of later sultans, his reign was pivotal in ensuring continuity, stability, and resilience. The empire had survived external threats, internal fragmentation, and the disruption of leadership transitions. Mehmed's calm, patient administration had preserved the foundations necessary for future growth. In retrospect, Mehmed I's era exemplifies the understated strength of the early Ottoman state. Expansion, governance, and diplomacy were carried out with deliberate care, creating an empire that could absorb shocks and continue its slow, steady rise. The quiet restoration under Mehmed set the stage for the transformative reigns of Murad II and Mehmed II, who would later expand the empire dramatically and achieve enduring fame. Thus, the story of Mehmed I is one of resilience, methodical governance, and the steady reweaving of an empire's fabric. Though the years may seem uneventful when compared to battles or conquests of later sultans, they were essential in shaping an empire capable of enduring the centuries to come. Murad II and the steady consolidation of power. The death of Mehmed I in 1421 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ottoman history. His son, Murad II, ascended the throne at a young age, inheriting an empire that had been restored to stability after the turbulence of the interregnum. Murad's early years were quiet in appearance, yet they carried the weight of immense responsibility. He faced the challenge of consolidating authority over Anatolia and Rumelia while preparing the state for future expansion. Unlike his grandfather Bayezid, whose reign had been defined by rapid military campaigns, Murad II approached governance with measured patience, allowing the empire to strengthen itself gradually before seeking new conquests. Early reign and internal challenges. Murad II assumed power at a time when the Ottoman state required careful guidance. Regional governors and local beys, accustomed to periods of semi-independence, needed reassurance that the central authority remained effective. Rather than confronting them with force immediately, Murad II relied on diplomacy, strategic marriages, and selective displays of power to maintain loyalty. This approach allowed the empire to remain cohesive while avoiding the instability that often accompanied youthful succession.
In Anatolia, several small principalities continued to exercise a degree of autonomy.
Some were remnants of beyliks that had not yet fully integrated into the Ottoman administrative structure, while others were newly assertive rulers testing the young sultan's resolve.
Murad's response was measured.
He deployed envoys to negotiate compliance, used promises of positions and rewards to encourage loyalty, and reserved military action for those who refused accommodation. In this way, the early years of his reign were marked by a deliberate, almost quiet, consolidation rather than explosive conflict.
Military organization and the Janissaries.
While Murad II's reign is often remembered for later battles, the initial years were characterized by slow, methodical development of military structures. The Janissary Corps, which had emerged under earlier sultans, continued to evolve during his rule. Recruitment through the Devshirme system expanded gradually, and these soldiers were trained not only for warfare but also in discipline, administration, and loyalty to the sultan. By maintaining a steady growth in this elite force, Murad II ensured that the empire possessed a reliable core capable of both defense and future campaigns. The Immerse system, which had supported Ottoman cavalry for generations, was also refined under Murad II. Land grants in exchange for military service allowed the empire to maintain a standing force without overburdening the treasury. This careful, incremental adjustment of military and administrative structures exemplified the Sultan's overall approach: stability first, expansion second.
Diplomacy in Rumelia.
In the European territories, Murad II faced the challenge of maintaining influence over a diverse and fragmented set of principalities. Serbia, Wallachia, Bulgaria, and various smaller Balkan states were all loosely aligned with Ottoman authority, but each region maintained its own internal dynamics. Rather than imposing direct rule immediately, Murad II cultivated alliances, secured oaths of loyalty, and integrated local elites into the Ottoman system. Tribute payments, marriage alliances, and occasional military demonstrations reinforced the perception of Ottoman dominance without provoking widespread rebellion. This method of careful integration allowed the empire to expand its influence in the Balkans gradually. Murad's approach was slow and deliberate, relying on long-term stability rather than immediate conquest. The subtlety of this strategy is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on later, more dramatic campaigns. Yet it was during this period that the foundation for Ottoman control over southeastern Europe was solidly established. The First Balkan Campaigns. Though the early years of Murad II's reign were dominated by consolidation, military action was never entirely absent. Sporadic campaigns into the Balkans occurred, but they were conducted with a level of planning and restraint characteristic of his overall style. These operations were typically limited in scale, designed to secure borders, enforce vassalage, or neutralize local opposition rather than to achieve spectacular victories. The Sultan's generals executed these campaigns with disciplined coordination, ensuring that each movement reinforced the empire's administrative structure. Newly acquired towns were quickly integrated, tax systems implemented, and local governance aligned with Ottoman norms. Even military action, therefore, carried the calm, methodical rhythm that defined Murad II's approach.
Challenges in Anatolia and the Karaman Beylik.
Anatolia remained a region of particular concern.
The Karamanids, one of the last independent Turkish principalities, continued to resist full incorporation into the Ottoman state.
Murad II responded with a combination of patience and precision. Rather than launching a full-scale invasion immediately, he used targeted military pressure, strategic diplomacy, and the threat of alliances to gradually weaken Karaman resistance. Over time, these measures brought the principality closer under Ottoman influence, demonstrating the effectiveness of careful, incremental statecraft.
Economic and social stability.
Murad II understood that military and political consolidation alone were insufficient for a strong empire. Economic and social stability were equally important. Markets in Bursa, Edirne, and other key cities were maintained, ensuring consistent trade flows. Agricultural production was carefully monitored, and land distribution through the Immerse system provided incentives for productive farming. Religious and charitable institutions continued to function, fostering social cohesion and reinforcing the Sultan's authority in subtle, everyday ways. The Ottoman approach to governance during Murad II's reign can be described as deliberate and calm. Rather than relying on fear, spectacle, or overwhelming force, the empire's strength lay in predictable systems, organized administration, and the slow integration of diverse populations. The quiet rhythm of daily life continued even as the empire expanded its influence, reflecting the long-term strategy of Ottoman consolidation.
Preparing for future expansion. By the mid-15th century, Murad II had laid the groundwork for the next phase of Ottoman growth. Administrative structures were solidified, military forces disciplined, and regional alliances stabilized. The empire was ready to resume expansion, but only after a prolonged period of internal strengthening. Murad II's careful stewardship ensured that when future conquests occurred, they would be sustainable and well-organized rather than impulsive or chaotic. In sum, the reign of Murad II exemplifies the slow, deliberate progression of an empire growing in both size and complexity. His leadership, characterized by methodical consolidation, careful diplomacy, and incremental military action, allowed the Ottoman state to emerge from the shadow of previous turmoil stronger and more resilient. Though lacking the dramatic flair often associated with history's great conquerors, Murad II's contributions were foundational, setting the stage for the transformative achievements of later sultans. The quiet years of Murad II's rule may seem uneventful at first glance. Yet beneath the calm surface, the Ottoman Empire was steadily preparing for a century of expansion, cultural development, and administrative sophistication. This period illustrates how patient governance, careful planning, and methodical integration can create a durable empire capable of enduring both internal and external challenges. The rise of Mehmed II and the calm before the conquest of Constantinople. The mid-15th century approached with an air of quiet inevitability. The Ottoman Empire, carefully consolidated under Murad II, now passed into the hands of his son, Mehmed II, later famously known as Mehmed the Conqueror. When Mehmed first ascended the throne, he was young and adolescent by the standards of his time and faced an empire already vast, yet delicate. His initial years were not marked by immediate conquests or dramatic shifts, but by steady preparation, education, and observation of the state machinery that his forefathers had patiently built. Mehmed II's early life was steeped in the patterns of Ottoman governance. He learned the intricacies of administration, military organization, and diplomacy under the watchful guidance of advisors and his father. These lessons were often unhurried, repetitive, and detailed, reflecting the slow, steady cadence of the Ottoman method. Mehmed observed the workings of provincial governors, the collection of taxes, the deployment of cavalry and infantry, and the careful interactions between the sultan and vassal states. Every minor detail contributed to his understanding of empire management, a slow accumulation of knowledge that would later allow him to act decisively when the moment arose. Early reign and the transition.
Mehmed II first ascended the throne in 1444, after the brief retirement of his father Murad II, who had grown weary of continuous campaigns. The empire at this point was stable but faced challenges from both within and beyond its borders. European powers, particularly Hungary and Wallachia, maintained a cautious watch over Ottoman movements.
In Anatolia, residual principalities and semi-independent rulers required the continuation of careful diplomacy to ensure loyalty. Mehmed's initial decisions were therefore slow, considered, and cautious. He relied heavily on Murad's experienced advisors while observing the rhythms of power and the responses of regional leaders to his authority. Despite the young sultan's accession, European observers noted little in the way of immediate expansion. Mehmed's actions were deliberate, his campaigns measured, his administrative adjustments incremental. He worked to maintain the Timar system, the cohesion of the Janissaries, and the loyalty of provincial governors. Mehmed's early years were a period of patient learning and observation, building the foundation for more dramatic undertakings later in his life. Diplomacy and alliances. During this period, Mehmed II maintained a network of careful diplomacy with both European and Anatolian states. Alliances were formed through marriage, treaties, and tributes rather than sudden conquest. Hungary and Venice were treated with subtle negotiation, balancing Ottoman strength against potential threats. In Anatolia, local rulers were integrated gradually into the central administration, some through voluntary submission, others through gentle coercion. The Ottomans relied on the predictability of governance, ensuring that taxation, military obligations, and legal systems remained functional throughout the territories. The young sultan's subtle management of foreign and domestic affairs illustrates the importance of patience and continuity. Mehmed II did not seek immediate glory, but instead observed the empire's existing structures, learning to use them effectively. By carefully navigating the complexities of both diplomacy and local governance, he ensured that when expansion did occur, it would rest on a solid foundation. Preparation for the ultimate conquest. One of the defining aspects of Mehmed II's early reign was preparation for future objectives. Among these, the city of Constantinople loomed large, though it was approached with quiet deliberation rather than immediate assault. Mehmed's early years were spent understanding the logistical, military, and political challenges involved in taking the Byzantine capital. This required patience, careful accumulation of resources, and meticulous planning, a slow, methodical process that could take years to perfect. Mehmed also oversaw the continued growth of the Janissaries, refining their training and ensuring that this elite corps would be capable of performing under extreme conditions. Cannons and emerging technology in siege warfare were studied and developed. The Ottoman navy began to expand in a deliberate, measured fashion, preparing for river and sea operations that would later prove critical. Every aspect of military preparation unfolded gradually, reflecting the empire's methodical approach to long-term objectives. Economic and social stability. While preparing for future campaigns, Mehmed II ensured that the empire's internal stability remained undisturbed. Trade flourished in Bursa, Edirne, and other major cities. Agricultural production was maintained and carefully monitored. The Timar system continued to provide military and economic balance. Religious institutions, charitable endowments, and madrasas supported social cohesion, reinforcing the perception of a stable and functional state. Daily life continued in a calm, predictable rhythm, even as the Sultan quietly laid the groundwork for monumental achievements. Mehmed II's early reign demonstrates the importance of patient observation and careful planning in statecraft.
Expansion was not immediate, conquest was postponed in favor of preparation.
This measured approach ensured that the empire's existing strengths were reinforced and its vulnerabilities addressed.
The Ottomans under Mehmed II were quietly but systematically becoming capable of extraordinary undertakings.
The calm before Constantinople.
The years between 1444 and 1451 can be seen as the calm before the Great Storm.
Mehmed II's observation, consolidation, and preparation set the stage for the dramatic events that would soon follow.
Constantinople, long a jewel of the Byzantine Empire and a symbol of Eastern Christendom, remained secure behind its massive walls.
Yet the Ottomans, patient and methodical, gradually prepared to transform this ancient city into the heart of a new empire.
By maintaining stability, reinforcing administrative structures, and quietly accumulating military strength, Mehmed II ensured that when the moment arrived, the empire would not be unprepared. The quiet rhythm of Ottoman governance, evident throughout the early centuries, continued to guide the state forward. Every small adjustment, every careful decision, contributed to the eventual success of the conquest that would later shock the world. Thus, the early reign of Mehmed II exemplifies the slow, methodical, almost meditative progression of the Ottoman Empire. Under his watchful, deliberate hand, the empire was poised for a transformation that would mark a turning point in world history. But in these years, the Sultan's work was quiet, internal, and patient, an empire quietly preparing for a future of extraordinary ambition.
The conquest of Constantinople, patience and precision.
The year 1453 arrived with a sense of inevitability. Mehmed II, now more experienced and confident after years of careful preparation, turned his attention fully to the city of Constantinople. Unlike the sudden, impulsive campaigns often highlighted in popular history, Mehmed's approach was meticulous, deliberate, and patient. The Ottoman Empire had matured over decades, learning the value of slow consolidation, and this long, measured process culminated in the siege of one of the world's most formidable cities.
The importance of Constantinople.
Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, was more than a strategic city, it was a symbol of the continuity of the Roman Empire in the East, a hub of trade, culture, and religion, and a fortress whose walls had withstood centuries of siege. Its location between Europe and Asia made it a crucial gateway for commerce, military strategy, and influence. Control of Constantinople meant dominance over the Bosporus, access to the Black Sea, and an unassailable position from which the Ottomans could expand further into Europe. Mehmed II understood all of this and approached the task with quiet determination. He knew that success required not brute force alone, but patience, strategy, and thorough preparation. The years spent studying the city's defenses, refining artillery, and training troops were about to pay off.
Preparation and logistics.
In the years leading up to 1453, Mehmed II focused on systematic preparation. Cannons, a relatively new but decisive technology in siege warfare, were developed, tested, and improved. The famous bombard, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, was one of the largest artillery pieces of its time, capable of slowly battering the walls of Constantinople.
But even with this technological advantage, Mehmed proceeded methodically.
The movement of troops, placement of artillery, supply lines, and naval coordination were all carefully planned. The Ottoman army, numbering tens of thousands, was deployed in a precise formation around the city. Soldiers were assigned clear roles, infantry to engage in direct operations, cavalry for flanking and skirmishes, and engineers to maintain siege engines and construct defensive works.
The Janissaries, well-trained and disciplined, held critical positions, ensuring that the army's rhythm remained controlled and steady.
Mehmed's approach reflected a larger Ottoman philosophy, the coordination of slow, deliberate action rather than hasty, dramatic confrontation. The siege begins. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed II's forces began the formal siege of Constantinople. The initial days were characterized by careful observation, probing attacks, and the systematic positioning of siege equipment. Rather than rushing, Mehmed allowed his engineers to study the walls, identifying weaknesses, and coordinating artillery placement for maximum effect. Daily routines maintained a calm rhythm, soldiers constructed platforms, cannons were moved, supplies organized, and scouts reported on Byzantine movements. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, responded with equal deliberation. Archers, artillery, and walls provided formidable resistance, but Mehmed's careful planning ensured that each Ottoman maneuver was calculated to minimize risk while applying continuous pressure. The siege was a slow, grinding process, unfolding over weeks, each day adding incrementally to the eventual collapse of the city's defenses. Naval operations and the Golden Horn. Mehmed II's attention to detail extended to naval operations. The Ottoman fleet, though smaller than the Byzantine ships, was strategically deployed to control access to the Golden Horn. Clever engineering solutions, such as dragging ships over land to bypass chains blocking the harbor, reflected the methodical ingenuity that defined the siege. Every step was deliberate, measured, and executed with precision. The city's defenders could do little to counter these slow, calculated maneuvers. The psychological dimension. Mehmed II understood that victory was as much about patience and psychological pressure as it was about brute force. Daily bombardments, small-scale attacks, and continuous presence created a sense of inevitability. The defenders' morale, while initially high, gradually waned under the steady, unrelenting pressure. Unlike chaotic battles in open fields, the siege of Constantinople was a study in sustained, measured dominance. Mehmed's calm and patient leadership ensured that his forces remained disciplined, while the defenders felt the slow encroachment of inevitable defeat. The final assault. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of methodical bombardment and careful preparation, Mehmed II ordered the final assault. The attack, while dramatic in its outcome, was the result of months of disciplined, incremental efforts. Soldiers advanced in coordinated waves, utilizing siege towers, ladders, and artillery breaches. The Byzantine defenders, exhausted by continuous pressure and dwindling resources, were ultimately unable to repel the disciplined Ottoman forces. The walls that had withstood centuries finally succumbed not to sudden chaos, but to patient, persistent effort. The fall of Constantinople marked a turning point in history. Mehmed II entered the city not in immediate celebration, but with a measured approach to governance. He understood the importance of integrating the city's population, preserving administrative structures, and maintaining stability. Constantinople was transformed into Istanbul, the new heart of the Ottoman Empire, but this transformation was gradual, reflecting the empire's characteristic patience and methodical administration. Integration and stability. Following the conquest, Mehmed II focused on consolidating control. Trade routes were restored, markets reopened, and religious and charitable institutions were maintained. Byzantine administrative structures were adapted rather than destroyed, ensuring continuity and stability. The population was gradually incorporated into the Ottoman system, and the city became a vibrant center of commerce, culture, and governance. Mehmed's calm, methodical approach allowed the empire to absorb one of the most important cities in the world without chaos or collapse. The legacy of patient conquest. The conquest of Constantinople exemplifies the Ottoman philosophy of slow, deliberate progression. Mehmed II's careful planning, systematic preparation, and measured execution transformed a centuries-old city into the foundation for further expansion. The empire's strength lay not only in its armies but in the patience, discipline, and organization cultivated over generations. Every cannon fired, every wall breached, every administrative decision reflected the empire's commitment to steady, controlled growth. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire had reached a new height. It was a state capable of combining military prowess, administrative efficiency, and long-term planning. Mehmed II's reign demonstrated that great achievements often arise not from sudden brilliance alone, but from careful, persistent, and patient preparation, a lesson embedded in the quiet rhythm of Ottoman history. The expansion under Mehmed II, slow consolidation and gradual growth. Following the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Mehmed II faced the quiet but complex task of transforming a newly captured city into the political, cultural, and economic heart of the Ottoman Empire. The capture of the city, though monumental, was only the beginning. The years that followed were marked not by dramatic campaigns alone, but by methodical consolidation, careful administration, and slow, deliberate expansion into surrounding territories. This period illustrates the Ottoman approach: patience, order, and systematic integration of new lands and peoples. Securing Constantinople. Mehmed II understood that Constantinople, with its population still adjusting to Ottoman rule, required careful governance. The city had survived centuries as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and many of its residents were unfamiliar with Ottoman administration. Mehmed's approach was measured. He retained skilled administrators from the Byzantine bureaucracy, integrating them into the Ottoman system. By preserving certain administrative structures, he ensured continuity in tax collection, legal proceedings, and public works, allowing daily life to proceed without disruption. Religious institutions were respected and incorporated into the new Ottoman framework. Churches were maintained initially, though some were later converted into mosques, reflecting both religious policy and practical administration. Mehmed's goal was not to impose immediate radical change but to allow the city to function effectively under Ottoman oversight. Markets reopened, trade continued, and craftsmen and merchants were encouraged to remain, preserving the economic vitality of the city. Gradual territorial expansion. While consolidating Constantinople, Mehmed II also pursued slow, careful expansion in surrounding regions. Thrace, the Balkans, and parts of Greece were gradually brought under more direct control. This process was methodical. Smaller territories were integrated first, fortresses were strengthened, and local leaders were co-opted into the Ottoman administrative system. Mehmed avoided impulsive campaigns that could destabilize newly acquired lands. Instead, he emphasized long-term stability, ensuring that each addition to the empire was sustainable and well-governed. The incorporation of these territories involved both diplomacy and limited military engagement. Local rulers were often offered positions within the Ottoman system in exchange for loyalty. Tribute arrangements were carefully negotiated, ensuring that the Ottoman administration benefited economically while minimizing the risk of rebellion. Mehmed's approach exemplified the principle that expansion was most effective when it was deliberate, planned, and balanced with administrative oversight. Military reforms and organization. The years following the conquest also saw continued refinement of the Ottoman military. The Janissary Corps expanded gradually, with recruits trained in discipline, strategy, and loyalty. Artillery units were maintained and further developed, taking advantage of technological innovations that had proven decisive during the siege of Constantinople. Cavalry forces were organized to maintain control over the countryside and respond to potential uprisings. Mehmed II's approach was not to overwhelm through sheer force alone, but to create a military system that was reliable, predictable, and capable of supporting gradual expansion. Siege tactics were also refined. Mehmed's engineers studied fortifications throughout the empire, preparing for future campaigns. Lessons learned from Constantinople were applied to smaller cities, allowing the Ottomans to conduct methodical, effective sieges when necessary. Each military engagement was planned with precision, reflecting the empire's long-standing emphasis on patient preparation. Administration and governance. Mehmed II paid careful attention to the integration of new territories into the empire's administrative system. Provincial governors were appointed based on loyalty, competence, and familiarity with local customs. Legal structures were standardized, though local practices were respected to reduce resistance. The Timar system continued to provide both economic stability and military readiness, ensuring that landholders contributed to the empire's needs while benefiting from their holdings. Trade was a priority. Mehmed encouraged commerce both within the empire and with neighboring states. Constantinople became a hub of trade connecting Europe and Asia, and Mehmed's policies promoted the movement of goods, the maintenance of roads, and the establishment of marketplaces. Economic stability reinforced political stability, creating a feedback loop that supported the empire's measured expansion. Relations with neighboring states. The Ottomans under Mehmed II also maintained a network of diplomacy with neighboring states. Venice, Hungary, the Crimean Khanate, and other regional powers were engaged through treaties, trade agreements, and selective military pressure. Mehmed's approach was strategic: avoid unnecessary conflict, maintain influence, and prepare for expansion when conditions were favorable. This deliberate, patient diplomacy minimized risks and ensured that the empire's growth was sustainable. In Anatolia, Mehmed continued to secure previously independent beyliks. The incorporation of these regions involved a combination of negotiation, targeted military pressure, and integration of local leaders into the Ottoman system. Mehmed's slow approach ensured that these territories became stable components of the empire rather than sources of continuous rebellion. Cultural and social development. Beyond military and administrative matters, Mehmed II supported cultural and social growth. Educational institutions, such as madrasas, were maintained and expanded. Scholars, artists, and architects were encouraged to contribute to the cultural life of the empire. Constantinople, in particular, became a center of intellectual activity, blending Byzantine heritage with Ottoman innovation. The city's gradual transformation reflected Mehmed's preference for careful, steady progress rather than abrupt, sweeping change. Charitable institutions and religious endowments were encouraged, supporting social cohesion and reinforcing the legitimacy of Ottoman rule. Mehmed II understood that governance was as much about maintaining the trust and loyalty of the population as it was about military conquest. Slow, deliberate cultivation of these social structures was a hallmark of his reign. Legacy of Mehmed II's early expansion. By the end of the 1450s, the Ottoman Empire had solidified its control over Constantinople and the surrounding regions. Mehmed II's methodical approach, patient consolidation, careful integration, and incremental expansion ensured that the empire's growth was sustainable. Unlike impulsive campaigns that could lead to instability, Mehmed's strategy emphasized long-term resilience, laying the groundwork for future conquests and administrative sophistication. The quiet, deliberate nature of Mehmed II's rule demonstrates a central principle of Ottoman governance. Strength is built not only through dramatic victories but through steady, measured progress. Each administrative reform, each military adjustment, each diplomatic engagement contributed incrementally to the empire's enduring stability. The Ottomans, through patient consolidation, had become a state capable of absorbing shocks, integrating diverse populations, and projecting power across multiple regions. Thus, the years following the conquest of Constantinople exemplify the Ottoman philosophy of slow, deliberate progression. Mehmed II's reign during this period was not about immediate glory but about laying a foundation that would allow the empire to thrive, expand, and endure for centuries. The quiet rhythm of governance, the patient integration of territories, and the careful cultivation of military, economic, and cultural structures illustrate the understated brilliance of Ottoman statecraft. The Balkans under Mehmed II, gradual control and methodical expansion. Following the consolidation of Constantinople and surrounding Anatolian territories, Mehmed II turned his attention steadily to the Balkans. This region, composed of diverse ethnic groups, principalities, and fragmented political structures, presented both opportunity and challenge. The Ottoman approach during this period was consistent with the patterns established over decades: slow, deliberate, and methodical expansion that emphasized stability, administration, and the gradual integration of conquered peoples. Initial focus on vassal states. In the Balkans, Mehmed II faced a patchwork of small states and principalities. Serbia, Wallachia, Bosnia, and remnants of Bulgarian territories retained local rulers who operated with significant autonomy. Rather than seeking immediate conquest through overwhelming force, Mehmed employed a combination of diplomacy, vassalage agreements, and selective military pressure. Tributary arrangements were established, in which local rulers maintained nominal authority in exchange for loyalty and regular payments. These arrangements minimized disruption to local governance while reinforcing Ottoman influence. The Ottomans approached these vassal states with patience. Military campaigns were limited and targeted, designed to enforce compliance rather than to provoke widespread destruction. Each intervention was carefully planned, ensuring that conquered territories could be smoothly integrated into the administrative system without destabilizing the region. Mehmed's strategy reflected the empire's understanding that rapid conquest without consolidation could create long-term instability. The role of fortresses and strategic outposts. As part of this methodical expansion, Mehmed II focused on fortresses and strategic outposts throughout the Balkans. Key locations such as Belgrade, Niš, and other fortified cities were reinforced or constructed to serve as centers of control. These strongholds allowed the Ottomans to project authority gradually, maintain secure supply lines, and respond to local resistance effectively. Each fortress functioned not only as a military installation but also as an administrative hub, supporting taxation, law enforcement, and communication between the central authority and regional leaders. This slow, deliberate approach to fortification ensured that the Ottoman advance in the Balkans was sustainable. Unlike campaigns that relied on temporary occupation, the Ottomans aimed to create a network of controlled territories capable of supporting further expansion. Fortresses became anchors around which new administrative and social structures could develop. Diplomatic engagement and local alliances. Mehmed II employed diplomacy alongside military strategy.
Marriage alliances, tribute agreements, and political marriages were used to secure loyalty and create networks of influence.
Local rulers were often integrated into the Ottoman system as governors or military commanders, providing them with a stake in the empire's success. This approach minimized the risk of rebellion and fostered cooperation among the local population. For example, in Wallachia, Mehmed's diplomacy alternated with limited military action to ensure that local leaders remained compliant without triggering widespread resistance. Similarly, in Bosnia and Serbia, careful negotiation and patient enforcement of vassal obligations allowed the Ottomans to extend influence steadily rather than relying on abrupt conquest.
Incremental military campaigns.
While diplomacy formed the backbone of Mehmed II's Balkan strategy, military campaigns were executed in a slow, methodical fashion. Each operation was carefully planned to achieve specific objectives, such as capturing a fortress, enforcing tribute, or neutralizing a rebellious faction. Campaigns were not designed for dramatic spectacle but for sustainable control. Troop movements, artillery placement, and supply lines were meticulously arranged to ensure efficiency and minimal disruption. The gradual approach allowed the Ottoman forces to maintain a steady rhythm of expansion. Territories were added incrementally, each with its administrative and military structures firmly in place before the next step was taken. This process reinforced the empire's stability and ensured that local populations could be gradually integrated into the Ottoman system. Integration of local populations. Mehmed II recognized that controlling the Balkans required more than military and administrative measures, it required social and cultural integration. Religious institutions, marketplaces, and educational centers were supported to maintain continuity and build loyalty. Christians and Muslims alike were incorporated into the social fabric through taxation, trade, and legal systems. The Ottomans often allowed local customs to continue, provided they did not conflict with overarching imperial objectives. This slow, patient approach minimized resistance and promoted long-term stability. The Devshirme system, while initially controversial, also played a role in this integration. Young boys from Christian families were recruited, trained, and incorporated into the Ottoman administrative and military system. Though disruptive on an individual level, this practice created a loyal cadre of administrators and soldiers who were deeply integrated into the empire, reinforcing the Ottoman model of patient, methodical governance. Economic consolidation in the Balkans. Economic policy was another pillar of Mehmed II's slow, deliberate expansion. Trade routes were secured, markets were maintained, and local production was encouraged. Agricultural land was organized under the Timar system, linking economic productivity to military service. This ensured a continuous supply of resources for both the army and civilian population. By maintaining economic stability, Mehmed II reinforced political authority and facilitated gradual integration of new territories. The strategic importance of the Balkans for trade between Europe and the Mediterranean also shaped Mehmed's approach. Controlling ports, river routes, and mountain passes allowed the empire to dominate commerce while maintaining gradual, stable expansion. Economic integration proceeded alongside administrative and military consolidation, reflecting a holistic approach to empire building. Cultural and administrative development. Mehmed II also focused on the cultural and administrative assimilation of Balkan territories. Educational institutions were encouraged, legal systems standardized, and local elites co-opted into administrative roles. By gradually aligning the region's institutions with Ottoman practices, Mehmed created a sense of order and predictability. The empire expanded not only in territory but also in systems of governance, law, and social organization. The integration process was slow by design. Immediate, radical changes could provoke unrest. Instead, the Ottoman approach relied on incremental adjustment, careful oversight, and gradual assimilation. Over time, this method transformed the Balkans into a stable, productive, and loyal part of the empire, capable of supporting future expansion further into Europe. Legacy of the Balkan expansion. The slow, methodical expansion into the Balkans exemplifies the Ottoman philosophy of patient governance. Mehmed II's approach was not about swift conquest or dramatic displays of power. It was about sustainable control, careful administration, and the gradual integration of diverse populations. Each decision, campaign, and administrative measure reflected a deliberate strategy designed to ensure long-term stability. By the end of Mehmed II's Balkan campaigns, the region had been largely brought under Ottoman influence, with vassal states integrated, key fortresses secured, and administrative systems aligned with central authority. The empire's methodical approach created a durable foundation for future European campaigns, reinforcing the principles of steady expansion, disciplined governance, and long-term planning that had guided the Ottomans for over a century. In sum, Mehmed II's work in the Balkans was a testament to the empire's slow, deliberate method of growth. Patience, precision, and persistent integration defined the Ottoman approach, turning a region of fragmented principalities into a stable, controlled, and productive part of the empire quietly, methodically, and without sudden upheaval. The Eastern campaigns, Anatolia and the Black Sea region under Mehmed II. While the Balkans occupied Mehmed II's attention to the west, the eastern frontiers of the Ottoman Empire required equally patient, methodical management. Anatolia and the Black Sea region were home to remaining independent beyliks, mountainous terrain, and populations accustomed to semi-autonomy. Mehmed II approached these eastern territories with the same slow, deliberate philosophy that had characterized his consolidation of Constantinople and the Balkans. The goal was not immediate conquest, but the gradual integration of these regions into a cohesive imperial framework. The Anatolian Beyliks. Anatolia, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, still contains several principalities with varying degrees of autonomy. The Karamanids, in particular, were a persistent challenge. Mehmed II did not rush into military action against them. Instead, he employed diplomacy, negotiation, and incremental pressure. Envoys were sent, promises of positions and privileges were offered, and the threat of force was maintained in the background. Over years, this careful, measured approach gradually eroded resistance while preserving the economic and social stability of the region. Other beyliks in central and eastern Anatolia were treated similarly. Mehmed's administration encouraged local cooperation through the appointment of loyal governors, integration of local elites into Ottoman administrative structures, and maintenance of regional trade networks. Gradual consolidation ensured that each territory became a stable component of the empire before attention shifted to the next. Strategic importance of the Black Sea. The Black Sea region was increasingly vital for Ottoman trade, security, and future expansion. Control over ports such as Sinop and Trabzon allowed access to maritime routes, facilitated commerce with neighboring regions, and ensured that the eastern frontiers were secure against potential adversaries, including the Genoese, the Venetians, and local principalities. Mehmed II's approach combined careful diplomacy with methodical fortification. Ports were reinforced, trade routes secured, and naval patrols gradually extended Ottoman influence across the northern coast. This process was deliberate. Rather than relying solely on aggressive conquest, Mehmed emphasized slow integration. Coastal towns and strategic positions were gradually brought under Ottoman control, while local populations were incorporated into the empire's administrative and economic systems. This steady process reflected the empire's overarching philosophy: patient, controlled expansion. Military organization in the East. In Anatolia and the Black Sea region, military organization was adapted to local conditions. Cavalry units were stationed in mountainous areas to respond to regional threats, while Janissary corps were deployed to strategic urban centers. Artillery units were prepared for sieges where necessary, although the Ottoman approach favored incremental campaigns over hasty assaults. Mehmed II's attention to logistics, supply chains, and troop discipline ensured that even distant territories could be managed efficiently, reinforcing long-term stability. Fortifications were a cornerstone of the Eastern strategy. Castles, city walls, and fortified outposts were repaired, expanded, or newly constructed to secure key routes and cities. These strongpoints served as anchors for administrative control, ensuring that newly integrated regions remained loyal and productive. The Ottomans' measured approach minimized the risk of rebellion and created a network of secure territories that facilitated gradual expansion. Integration of local populations. Mehmed II understood that political and military control alone were insufficient. Social and cultural integration was essential for long-term stability. Local religious institutions were respected, marketplaces maintained, and educational centers supported. The devshirm system was applied selectively, recruiting young men for training and service, creating a loyal cadre capable of administering and defending the empire. By gradually incorporating local populations into Ottoman structures, Mehmed ensured that control extended beyond the walls of fortresses and administrative centers. The empire's legal and administrative systems were introduced carefully, respecting local customs where possible. Taxation was standardized gradually, ensuring economic stability without provoking unrest. Markets, crafts, and trade networks continued to function, supporting both local economies and imperial revenues. Mehmed II's methodical approach emphasized sustainability over speed, creating a stable foundation for future expansion. Relations with neighboring powers. The eastern frontier brought the Ottomans into contact with neighboring powers, including the emerging states in Persia, the remnants of the Byzantine influence along the coast, and maritime powers like Genoa and Venice. Mehmed II's strategy was deliberate diplomacy combined with strategic military presence. Treaties, trade agreements, and temporary alliances ensured that expansion did not provoke unnecessary conflict. When military action was required, it was precise, limited, and well-coordinated, reflecting the overall philosophy of methodical consolidation. These diplomatic efforts complemented the military and administrative strategies, creating a network of stable relationships that reinforced Ottoman control. By patiently balancing force and negotiation, Mehmed II ensured that eastern territories remained under imperial influence without destabilizing the region's economic consolidation and trade. Economic development was a central aspect of Mehmed II's eastern campaigns. The Black Sea offered opportunities for trade in grain, timber, fish, and other goods.
The Ottomans gradually established control over key ports, ensuring safe passage for merchants and collecting taxes on commerce. Internal trade routes were maintained, roads repaired, and caravans monitored to facilitate smooth economic activity. The slow, steady approach to economic integration reinforced political and social control, exemplifying the empire's holistic method of governance. The integration of eastern Anatolia also allowed for greater access to resources, supporting both local and imperial needs. Agricultural production, mining operations, and crafts were systematically incorporated into the Ottoman economic system. By linking military, administrative, and economic structures, Mehmed II created a stable, self-sustaining framework that allowed the empire to expand at a measured pace. Cultural and administrative development. Cultural integration was gradual but consistent. Scholars, religious leaders, and craftsmen were encouraged to participate in the Ottoman system. Madrasas and religious schools were supported, promoting literacy, law, and Islamic learning. Local elites were given administrative roles, fostering loyalty and familiarity with Ottoman practices. By carefully blending local traditions with central governance, Mehmed II created a cohesive, controlled, and culturally integrated eastern frontier. Legacy of Eastern Campaigns. The Eastern campaigns under Mehmed II exemplified the Ottoman philosophy of deliberate expansion. Military force, administrative control, economic integration, and cultural assimilation were applied incrementally, creating a durable, stable empire capable of sustained growth. The careful, methodical approach minimized resistance, maximized productivity, and reinforced loyalty, allowing the Ottomans to gradually extend their influence across Anatolia and the Black Sea region. In essence, Mehmed II's Eastern policies demonstrate that empire building is not always about rapid conquest or dramatic victories. It is often the quiet, patient, and deliberate work fortifying cities, integrating populations, securing trade, and establishing administrative structures that ensures long-term stability. The calm rhythm of Mehmed II's governance in the East exemplifies this principle, showing how a patient empire can grow steadily, resiliently, and sustainably. Mehmed II in the Mediterranean, gradual naval expansion and trade control. As Mehmed II consolidated the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople, the Balkans, and eastern Anatolia, his attention gradually shifted to the Mediterranean. This region, a complex network of islands, ports, and maritime powers, required careful, methodical attention. The Mediterranean was not conquered overnight, rather, it was approached with patience, incremental strategy, and slow integration. Mehmed II's goal was to secure trade routes, assert Ottoman influence, and gradually incorporate maritime territories into the empire's sphere of control. Initial naval developments. The Ottomans had historically been a land-based power, but Mehmed II recognized the strategic importance of naval strength. Control of the Mediterranean meant control of trade, influence over islands and coastal cities, and the ability to project power across a maritime network. Mehmed invested in building ships, training sailors, and establishing shipyards. The expansion was deliberate, fleets were small initially, tested in minor engagements, and slowly reinforced to ensure operational efficiency. Rather than launching dramatic attacks, Mehmed focused on steady development. Ports along the Aegean and Marmara Seas were reinforced, shipbuilding technology improved, and logistical support for maritime operations strengthened. Every ship constructed and every sailor trained contributed to the slow, controlled growth of Ottoman naval capacity. Control of the Dardanelles and the Sea of Marmara. One of Mehmed II's earliest objectives in the Mediterranean was control of the Dardanelles Strait and the Sea of Marmara. These waterways connected the Aegean Sea with the Black Sea and were essential for trade, military mobility, and regional influence. The Ottomans gradually fortified key ports along the strait, ensuring that naval traffic could be monitored, defended, and taxed. Control over these narrow waterways allowed Mehmed to project power both westward toward the Aegean Islands and northward toward the Black Sea, supporting earlier Eastern campaigns. The process was methodical. Fortifications were constructed slowly, cannons placed carefully, and garrisons trained to defend against both land and sea incursions. Mehmed's patient approach minimized the risk of overextension and ensured that naval dominance was built on a stable foundation. Engagement with maritime powers. The Mediterranean was populated by powerful maritime states such as Venice, Genoa, and the Knights of Rhodes. Mehmed too engaged these powers gradually, combining diplomacy, trade agreements, and selective displays of force. Venice, in particular, was a critical partner and rival. Ottoman diplomacy sought to secure favorable trade agreements, limit interference, and gradually expand influence without provoking full-scale war. Naval engagements were deliberate and small-scale initially. Mehmed focused on securing key coastal positions and asserting Ottoman authority over trade routes. Instead of immediate large-scale conflict, the strategy emphasized incremental control, careful positioning, and sustained pressure. Over time, this gradual approach allowed the Ottomans to expand influence without unnecessary risk. Island campaigns and strategic expansion. The Mediterranean islands were treated with patience and precision. Islands such as Lesbos, Chios, and others were integrated gradually through diplomacy, negotiation, or selective military action. Fortifications were reinforced, administrative oversight extended, and local populations slowly incorporated into the Ottoman system. Mehmed II's methodical approach ensured that each acquisition was stable, economically productive, and strategically valuable. The islands were valuable not only for their ports but also as bases for projecting naval power and protecting trade routes. By gradually securing these territories, the Ottomans established a network of control that allowed for later, larger naval campaigns in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Economic integration. Trade was central to Mehmed II's Mediterranean policy. Control over ports and maritime routes allowed the Ottomans to collect taxes on goods, regulate commerce, and encourage economic activity. Markets were gradually integrated into the imperial system, ensuring that trade benefited both local populations and the central treasury. Agricultural and artisanal production on coastal territories was supported and organized under Ottoman administration. This slow, deliberate integration stabilized the region economically. Local populations continued to engage in familiar economic activities while adapting to Ottoman oversight. Mehmed II's patient approach minimized disruption and maximized long-term profitability, illustrating the empire's broader philosophy of methodical expansion. Naval administration and training. Mehmed II also focused on establishing an administrative framework for naval operations. Admirals were appointed based on loyalty and experience, shipyards managed carefully, and logistics coordinated to support ongoing campaigns. Sailors were trained in navigation, gunnery, and ship maintenance, ensuring that the fleet could operate reliably. Ottomans to test their capabilities gradually, refine strategies, and strengthen naval readiness without overstretching resources. The combination of military training, administrative oversight, and logistical preparation exemplified the Ottoman approach to controlled expansion. Mehmed II understood that successful naval campaigns required more than ships; they demanded organization, discipline, and patient planning. Integration of coastal populations. Populations along the Aegean and Marmara coasts were integrated gradually into the Ottoman system. Religious institutions were supported, marketplaces maintained, and local governance adapted rather than abolished. Mehmed II ensured that coastal communities remained productive, loyal, and capable of contributing to the empire's maritime strength. Social stability complemented military control, reinforcing the empire's long-term strategic position. The Devshirme system, applied carefully along coastal regions, provided a pool of trained administrators and soldiers for both land and naval service. These incremental efforts strengthened the empire's overall governance while fostering loyalty among newly incorporated populations. Long-term strategy and legacy. Mehmed II's Mediterranean policy demonstrates the Ottoman philosophy of slow, deliberate empire building. Each port, island, and naval base was incorporated gradually, integrated administratively, and stabilized socially and economically. By focusing on measured expansion, sustained control, and strategic patience, Mehmed II created a foundation for later Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The calm, methodical rhythm of these operations reflects the broader principles of Ottoman governance. Expansion was not a matter of impulsive conquest, it was the result of decades of careful preparation, patient diplomacy, and incremental integration. Mehmed II's success in the Mediterranean illustrates that the quiet, steady accumulation of influence often produces more durable and lasting power than sudden, dramatic victories. Through slow naval buildup, strategic fortifications, incremental campaigns, and careful social and economic integration, Mehmed II extended Ottoman influence into the Mediterranean while maintaining stability at home. This period set the stage for future Ottoman expansion into Europe, North Africa, and beyond, proving that patient, deliberate action could yield monumental results. The reign of Bayezid II: consolidation, diplomacy, and slow governance. After Mehmed II's death in 1481, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of consolidation under his son, Bayezid II. Unlike Mehmed's campaigns of conquest, Bayezid's reign emphasized careful governance, diplomacy, and the methodical reinforcement of the empire's vast territories. This period is notable not for dramatic battles or sudden territorial expansion, but for slow, deliberate measures to stabilize the empire, maintain internal cohesion, and strengthen its economic and administrative foundations. The transition of power. Bayezid II inherited a vast, complex empire. Constantinople was established as the imperial capital, the Balkans and Anatolia had been gradually integrated, and the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions were under Ottoman influence. The empire was powerful, yet fragile, with diverse populations, regional leaders accustomed to autonomy, and distant territories that required careful oversight. Bayezid's approach was deliberate and patient. Rather than attempting dramatic displays of authority, he focused on steady, methodical consolidation. The succession was smooth compared to many contemporary empires, and Bayezid immediately set about reinforcing governance structures, ensuring that local administrators and military commanders were loyal, and gradually integrating new territories. Administrative reforms. One of Bayezid II's first priorities was administrative reform. He recognized that the empire's growth under Mehmed II had created complex networks of governance that required careful oversight. Provincial governors were evaluated and, when necessary, replaced with officials of proven loyalty. Timar allocations were reviewed to ensure military service obligations were met and that landholders remained productive. Judicial systems were standardized incrementally. Local courts continued to operate according to traditional practices, but were gradually aligned with central Ottoman legal standards. Religious authorities were respected and incorporated into governance, ensuring that Islamic law complemented local customs. The gradual nature of these reforms minimized unrest while improving the efficiency and predictability of governance. diplomacy and international relations. Bayezid II's reign emphasized slow, deliberate diplomacy. Relationships with neighboring powers, including Venice, Hungary, the Safavid states, and the Mamluks, were carefully managed. Treaties were negotiated, trade agreements established, and minor conflicts resolved without the need for large-scale military campaigns. Diplomacy was often a patient game of negotiation and incremental influence, reflecting the Ottoman preference for gradual expansion and careful management. For example, relations with Venice were carefully balanced. The Venetians controlled key Mediterranean trade routes and ports, and open conflict could disrupt commerce and provoke instability. Bayezid maintained diplomatic channels, negotiated agreements on trade rights, and slowly extended Ottoman influence through economic and political means rather than sudden military conquest. Economic consolidation. Economic stability was central to Bayezid II's reign. Tax collection systems were reviewed, trade routes maintained, and markets regulated. Agricultural production was encouraged, and infrastructure such as roads and bridges was repaired or expanded. Coastal ports and maritime trade routes were gradually integrated into the empire's administrative and economic framework. This slow, careful approach ensured that wealth continued to flow to the central treasury, supporting both military readiness and civil administration. Local populations experienced continuity in trade and daily life, which reinforced loyalty to the empire. Gradual economic integration allowed Bayezid to maintain stability across the diverse regions of the empire. Military oversight and reform. Although Bayezid II's reign was less characterized by conquest, military readiness remained a priority. The Janissary Corps continued to be trained and expanded slowly, with careful attention to discipline and loyalty. Artillery units were maintained, and fortifications across the empire were repaired or reinforced. The navy, particularly in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, was gradually strengthened, ensuring that trade routes and coastal territories were secure. Military campaigns during Bayezid's reign were limited and highly methodical. Small-scale operations focused on enforcing tribute, suppressing local rebellions, or reinforcing borders. Each operation was carefully planned and executed, reflecting the Ottoman philosophy of patience and methodical governance. Handling internal challenges. Bayezid II faced internal challenges, including rival claimants to the throne and regional leaders who occasionally resisted central authority. Rather than engaging in abrupt or violent suppression, Bayezid often used negotiation, incentives, and careful monitoring to maintain loyalty. Revolts were addressed promptly but selectively, with an emphasis on minimizing disruption to administration and daily life. This measured approach reinforced the empire's stability. Local populations gradually accepted Ottoman authority, not through sudden conquest, but through steady, patient governance. Bayezid's methods ensured that internal cohesion was maintained, even in a vast empire with diverse populations and complex regional dynamics. Cultural and religious policies. Bayezid II also continued Mehmed II's tradition of supporting cultural and religious development. Madrasas, mosques, and charitable institutions were maintained and expanded. Scholars, artists, and religious leaders were encouraged to contribute to the intellectual and cultural life of the empire. Local populations, including Christians and Jews, were integrated into the social and economic framework, provided they adhered to Ottoman legal and fiscal obligations. The gradual cultural integration fostered loyalty and social cohesion. By encouraging participation in the empire's institutions, Bayezid ensured that diverse communities could coexist peacefully under Ottoman authority. This methodical approach reduced the risk of unrest while enhancing the empire's long-term stability. Consolidation of the Balkans and eastern frontiers. During Bayezid II's reign, the Balkans and eastern frontiers were further consolidated. Tributary states in the Balkans were gradually absorbed, fortifications reinforced, and local governance aligned with central Ottoman administration. In the east, Anatolia and Black Sea territories were stabilized, trade routes secured, and fortresses maintained. This slow, steady process reinforced Ottoman control and created a durable administrative and military framework. The incremental approach allowed the empire to strengthen its frontiers without overextending resources. Each region was carefully integrated into the empire's system before additional expansion was considered, reflecting the overarching philosophy of patient, deliberate governance. Legacy of Bayezid II. Bayezid II's reign illustrates the Ottoman commitment to gradual, methodical statecraft. While dramatic conquests often capture historical attention, it was the slow, patient work of consolidation, diplomacy, economic management, and cultural integration that sustained the empire and prepared it for future expansion. Bayezid's calm, steady governance ensured that the empire remained stable, prosperous, and cohesive, setting the stage for his successors to continue the Ottoman project with a strong foundation. By focusing on long-term stability rather than immediate glory, Bayezid II reinforced a central principle of Ottoman administration: patient, deliberate effort, applied across military, administrative, economic, and social domains, produces enduring power. The empire's strength during this period was not always visible in battles or sieges but in the quiet, methodical rhythm of governance that defined his reign. Selim I and the Eastern conquests, gradual expansion into the Middle East. Following the measured consolidation under Bayezid II, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of renewed territorial expansion under Selim I, who ascended the throne in 1512. Unlike his father's reign, which focused on patient governance, Selim's period marked the beginning of dramatic expansion eastward. Yet even in this era of conquest, the Ottoman approach remained methodical, deliberate, and carefully organized, reflecting centuries of statecraft that emphasized sustainability over impulsive action. Selim I's ascension and early challenges. Selim I, often known as Selim the Grim, inherited a stable but complex empire. Constantinople remained the imperial heart, and the Balkans, Anatolia, and Mediterranean regions were firmly under Ottoman control. However, the eastern frontiers faced persistent challenges: rival dynasties, tribal confederations, and distant principalities posed potential threats. Selim's initial task was to secure loyalty among governors, manage internal dissent, and ensure the army's readiness for campaigns beyond Anatolia. Rather than rushing into conflict, Selim assessed the political and geographic landscape carefully. His decisions were informed by intelligence gathering, regional diplomacy, and the evaluation of local alliances. Each military or administrative move was deliberate, aimed at creating a sustainable path for expansion. Conflict with the Safavids. One of Selim I's primary concerns was the growing power of the Safavid dynasty in Persia. The Safavids, adherents of Sharia Islam, presented both a religious and geopolitical challenge to the Sunni Ottoman state. Selim approached this slowly. He fortified eastern Anatolian cities, strengthened garrisons, and gradually expanded Ottoman influence among border tribes to secure alliances. Military campaigns against the Safavids were carefully planned. Each engagement was prepared with attention to supply lines, terrain, and troop readiness. Instead of impulsive attacks, Selim ensured that his forces could operate efficiently in the mountainous eastern regions, creating a pattern of gradual, sustained pressure that eventually led to decisive victories.
The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate. Selimi's eastern expansion eventually turned toward the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz.
This region was both strategically and economically important, linking the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Islamic holy cities. Selim's campaigns against the Mamluks were meticulously prepared over months, involving careful coordination of multiple armies, artillery units, and logistical support. The battles of Marj Dabak in 1516 and Redania in 1517 were not mere displays of force, they were the culmination of deliberate strategy. Ottoman forces moved slowly, consolidating territories as they advanced, securing supply lines, and integrating local populations through diplomacy and governance. Each city captured was reinforced with administrators, garrisons, and legal structures, ensuring stability before the next advance. Administrative integration of conquered lands. After each campaign, Selim I implemented methodical administrative integration. Provinces in Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz were organized into the Ottoman provincial system, with governors appointed for loyalty and competence. Local elites were incorporated into governance, while Islamic legal and judicial institutions were aligned with Ottoman practices. Economic systems, including taxation and trade regulation, were gradually standardized to ensure continuity and prosperity. Religious and cultural institutions were respected. Madrasas, mosques, and Christian communities were integrated carefully, maintaining social cohesion and minimizing unrest. The Devshirme system and the Janissary Corps were extended selectively to the new territories, ensuring loyalty and administrative efficiency. Economic and trade considerations. The eastern conquests under Selim I had profound economic implications. Control over Syria and Egypt allowed the Ottomans to dominate key trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Mediterranean ports and Red Sea ports were gradually integrated into the Ottoman trade network, ensuring a steady flow of goods, wealth, and resources to the imperial treasury. Economic integration was deliberate, balancing local production and trade with imperial oversight, ensuring long-term stability. Agricultural production, artisanal craft, and urban commerce were all systematically organized under Ottoman administration. Markets continued to operate, roads were repaired, and ports managed carefully. The gradual approach allowed the economy to function efficiently, supporting both local populations and the expanding Ottoman state. Military organization and fortification. Selim I's campaigns were marked by careful military planning. Artillery units were positioned strategically for sieges, cavalry units were deployed in mountainous regions, and supply lines meticulously maintained. Fortresses and cities captured were immediately reinforced, providing a secure base for further expansion. This methodical approach minimized risk and ensured the sustainability of the empire's eastern conquests. Naval operations in the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea were also strengthened gradually. Ships, garrisons, and port fortifications were improved to protect trade routes, supply lines, and Ottoman influence over maritime commerce. Each naval deployment was carefully timed and strategically coordinated with land campaigns. Religious and cultural integration. The incorporation of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina marked a significant religious achievement. Selim I established the Ottoman Sultan as the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, integrating the Hijaz into the empire's religious and political framework. Religious institutions were gradually aligned with Ottoman governance, ensuring smooth administration and respect for local traditions. This careful integration reinforced both spiritual authority and political legitimacy. Scholars, religious leaders, and administrators were encouraged to participate in governance, fostering loyalty and continuity. Cultural integration proceeded incrementally, respecting local practices while gradually introducing Ottoman administrative and legal systems. Legacy of Selim I's Eastern expansion. Selim I's Eastern conquests illustrate the Ottoman philosophy of deliberate expansion, even in an era marked by military aggression. While the campaigns were more forceful than those of Bayezid II, they were meticulously planned, carefully executed, and gradually consolidated. Territories were integrated administratively, economically, and socially before the next advance, ensuring that the empire remained stable and sustainable. By the end of Selim I's reign, the Ottoman Empire had extended its control across the Middle East, encompassing Egypt, Syria, the Hejaz, and eastern Anatolia. The combination of military precision, administrative integration, economic oversight, and cultural accommodation created a durable framework for Ottoman governance. Selim's methodical approach allowed the empire to expand dramatically while maintaining long-term stability, reinforcing the Ottoman principle that slow, deliberate integration is as vital as conquest itself. In summary, the Eastern campaigns under Selim I demonstrate that even rapid expansion requires methodical preparation, careful administration, and patient integration. The Ottoman Empire's enduring strength rested not solely on dramatic victories, but on the quiet, deliberate work of consolidating power, organizing governance, and steadily incorporating diverse populations into a coherent imperial system. Suleiman the Magnificent, gradual consolidation and legal reforms. Following the eastern expansions of Selim I, the Ottoman Empire entered one of its most renowned periods under Suleiman I, commonly known as Suleiman the Magnificent. While Suleiman is often remembered for his military campaigns and territorial expansion, a significant portion of his reign was devoted to careful, methodical consolidation, legal reform, and the steady governance of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. The slow, deliberate actions of this period reinforced the empire's foundations, ensuring long-term stability and continuity. Suleiman's accession and early governance. Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, inheriting an empire that was vast, diverse, and complex. Constantinople remained the imperial center, while the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa had been integrated under previous rulers. Suleiman's first years were characterized by measured governance, focusing on the reinforcement of central authority, assessment of provincial administrators, and review of military and fiscal systems. Rather than rushing into military campaigns, Suleiman took time to study the empire's administration. He inspected provincial governance, reviewed legal practices, and assessed the loyalty of military commanders. These early actions were deliberate, emphasizing stability and long-term efficiency over immediate conquest. Legal reforms and codification. One of Suleiman's most notable contributions was his comprehensive legal reform, earning him the title Kanuni, or lawgiver. These reforms were gradual, carefully implemented, and designed to standardize the application of law across diverse regions. Existing Sharia law was harmonized with customary practices, ensuring that legal codes were both consistent and respectful of local traditions. The codification process was methodical. Legal scholars, judges, and administrators were consulted, and laws were introduced incrementally. This approach minimized disruption while reinforcing the authority of the central government. By standardizing legal practices, Suleiman strengthened social cohesion, facilitated dispute resolution, and created a predictable framework for governance throughout the empire. Administrative consolidation. Suleiman continued the careful administrative policies of his predecessors. Provincial governors were assessed for competence and loyalty, while the Timar system was reviewed to ensure effective military service and productive land use. Bureaucracy was refined gradually, balancing central oversight with local autonomy. Local elites were incorporated into the Ottoman administrative system, ensuring cooperation and minimizing resistance. This methodical approach extended to taxation, infrastructure, and urban management. Roads were maintained, bridges repaired, and cities gradually developed to support commerce and administration. Each administrative adjustment was incremental, ensuring that the empire remained functional and stable across vast distances. Military organization and training. While Suleiman conducted military campaigns, the organization of the army remained meticulous and patient. The Janissary Corps continued to be trained, disciplined, and carefully expanded. Cavalry units were positioned strategically, artillery maintained and modernized, and supply chains organized to support extended campaigns. Military action was deliberate, with careful planning preceding each operation. Campaigns were not merely about conquest, they were about sustainable occupation. Fortresses were reinforced, administrative oversight extended, and local populations gradually integrated into the Ottoman system. This deliberate military strategy ensured that victories translated into lasting control rather than temporary occupation. Diplomacy and regional stability. Suleiman's reign was marked by cautious diplomacy alongside military action. Treaties with European powers, neighboring Islamic states, and distant principalities were negotiated with patience. Conflicts were often resolved through negotiation, trade agreements, or incremental influence before resorting to warfare. The empire's external relations reflected a broader Ottoman philosophy. Measured, deliberate engagement ensured long-term security. Relations with Venice, the Habsburgs, and Safavid Persia were particularly significant. Diplomatic negotiations were conducted patiently, sometimes over years, to manage territorial disputes, secure trade routes, and maintain peace along sensitive frontiers. Gradual, deliberate diplomacy complemented military expansion and reinforced the empire's stability. Economic management. Economic stability was central to Suleiman's strategy. Trade routes across the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and inland regions were maintained and gradually expanded. Markets, urban production, and artisanal crafts were carefully organized under Ottoman administration. Taxation was standardized, ensuring predictable revenue without excessive disruption to local populations. Infrastructure projects were incremental but deliberate. Roads, ports, bridges, and marketplaces were maintained and slowly improved, facilitating trade and communication across the empire. Economic integration reinforced political stability, allowing the Ottoman Empire to sustain its military, administrative, and cultural expansion over time. Cultural and religious integration. Suleiman fostered cultural development alongside administrative and military consolidation. Madrasas, mosques, and charitable institutions were supported, contributing to intellectual and spiritual life. Religious diversity was managed through careful oversight, ensuring coexistence while maintaining Ottoman authority. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were gradually integrated into the social, economic, and legal frameworks of the empire. Art, architecture, and literature were patronized deliberately, reflecting both imperial prestige and cultural cohesion. Urban centers were developed slowly, with careful planning to accommodate administrative functions, trade, and cultural life. This deliberate integration strengthened the empire's identity while respecting local traditions. Gradual expansion in Europe. While Suleiman's military campaigns are well known, each advance in Europe was characterized by careful preparation, methodical occupation, and administrative consolidation. Cities and fortresses were captured with planning and precision. Local populations were gradually integrated, and Ottoman administration extended incrementally to ensure stability. This approach minimized resistance and reinforced the empire's long-term presence in Europe. Legacy of Suleiman's methodical rule. Suleiman the Magnificent exemplifies the Ottoman principle of gradual, deliberate statecraft. His reign combined military prowess with patient governance, legal reform, economic stability, and cultural development. Territories were integrated methodically, administrative structures refined, and local populations incorporated gradually into the empire's framework. Suleiman's careful approach ensured that Ottoman expansion was sustainable, durable, and resilient. Through slow consolidation, legal codification, administrative refinement, and incremental military campaigns, Suleiman strengthened the empire's foundations for centuries to come. The steady rhythm of governance, rather than dramatic conquest alone, ensured the Ottoman Empire's enduring strength and cohesion. The Ottoman Golden Age, administrative maturity and societal integration. Following the long reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire entered a period often referred to as its Golden Age. This era was not defined solely by military conquest, although expansion continued, but by the slow, deliberate consolidation of governance, refinement of administration, and integration of the diverse societies under Ottoman control. The calm, measured pace of these developments ensured the durability and cohesion of an empire that spanned continents and cultures. Administrative maturity. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman administrative system had achieved a remarkable degree of maturity. The empire was divided into provinces, or eyalets, each governed by appointed officials whose duties were carefully defined and monitored. The provincial system operated with a combination of central oversight and local autonomy, ensuring both control and flexibility. Governors were accountable to the central authority, yet local elites were gradually incorporated into governance structures, creating a system of layered authority that maintained order without provoking unnecessary unrest. Legal and bureaucratic procedures were standardized incrementally. Courts operated under Islamic law, yet customary practices were respected, particularly in rural areas. Taxation was refined and implemented systematically, ensuring predictable revenue without disrupting local economies. The Timar system for military service remained in place, gradually adjusted to reflect demographic and territorial changes, sustaining the empire's defense and administrative capabilities. Societal integration. The Ottoman approach to societal integration was gradual and deliberate. The empire encompassed Muslims, Christians, Jews, and various ethnic and linguistic groups. Rather than enforcing uniformity, the Ottomans maintained the millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern themselves in matters of personal law, education, and worship, while remaining loyal to the central state. This slow, careful integration fostered social cohesion, minimized rebellion, and encouraged loyalty through autonomy. Urban centers became hubs of administration, commerce, and culture. Markets operated under regulated conditions, artisans practiced trades within guilds, and education was supported through madrasas and charitable institutions. Infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and aqueducts was maintained gradually, ensuring the smooth functioning of both trade and administration. The empire's societal stability relied not on coercion but on the patient management of daily life. Economic consolidation and trade networks. Economic life during the Ottoman Golden Age was characterized by methodical consolidation. Trade routes across Europe, Asia, and Africa were maintained and gradually expanded. Ports on the Mediterranean, Aegean, and Black Sea were secured, and inland trade networks were integrated into the empire's system. Markets, bazaars, and caravanserais facilitated commerce, while taxation and regulation were implemented incrementally to maintain fairness and efficiency. Agricultural production was monitored and supported. Landowners, farmers, and rural communities were incorporated into the empire's economic framework, with careful attention to sustaining productivity. Artisans and merchants were regulated through guilds and licensing, ensuring stable supply chains and controlled competition. This slow, methodical approach to economic integration reinforced both political stability and imperial revenue. Military organization and readiness. Even during periods of relative peace, military organization remained a priority. The Janissary Corps was maintained and trained continuously, artillery units were updated, and fortresses across the empire were reinforced gradually. Cavalry and provincial troops were stationed strategically to respond to local disturbances and protect borders. Campaigns, when they occurred, were carefully prepared, with attention to logistics, terrain, and supply lines. The Ottoman Navy, strengthened over decades, ensured control over strategic ports and trade routes in the Mediterranean, Aegean, and Black Sea. Naval deployments were methodical and coordinated, supporting both military and economic objectives. This careful balance of readiness, fortification, and incremental expansion exemplified the Ottoman philosophy of deliberate, sustainable power projection. Cultural and intellectual life. Cultural integration and intellectual development proceeded slowly but steadily. Scholars, artists, poets, and architects were supported, often by state patronage. Islamic scholarship thrived, yet Christian and Jewish communities were allowed to maintain their educational and religious institutions. The gradual blending of cultural practices enhanced social cohesion, fostering loyalty and participation in imperial life. Architecture and city planning reflected both functionality and prestige. Mosques, madrasas, bridges, and marketplaces were constructed or renovated with careful planning. Public works projects were executed incrementally, ensuring long-term utility without straining resources. These slow, steady efforts reinforced the empire's image of authority, stability, and cultural sophistication. Relations with Europe and neighboring powers. The Ottoman Empire maintained a complex web of diplomacy with European states, Persian powers, and North African territories. Treaties were negotiated patiently, conflicts were resolved incrementally, and influence was extended through trade, alliances, and selective military action. Rather than relying solely on conquest, the Ottomans combined negotiation, economic pressure, and carefully orchestrated campaigns to maintain regional dominance. For example, relations with the Habsburgs involved decades of measured negotiation, occasional skirmishes, and carefully timed military engagements. Trade agreements with Venice and Genoa were negotiated gradually, ensuring economic benefit without provoking open conflict. This slow, strategic approach allowed the empire to maintain stability and control while projecting influence across Europe and the Mediterranean. Urban and regional planning. Cities across the empire were managed with deliberate attention to infrastructure, commerce, and social services. Markets, water supply, and roads were maintained systematically, while urban planning accommodated growth without disruption. Fortifications were reinforced incrementally to defend against both external threats and internal unrest. Provincial governance operated through layers of administration. Local leaders were gradually incorporated into central systems, balancing authority and autonomy. This careful structuring ensured that the empire's vast and diverse population could be governed efficiently and peacefully. Legacy of the Ottoman Golden Age. The Ottoman Golden Age demonstrates that empire building relies not solely on conquest or military prowess but on slow, deliberate, and continuous effort across multiple dimensions: administrative efficiency, economic stability, social integration, military readiness, and cultural cohesion. The empire's success during this period was a product of patient governance, measured expansion, and the methodical integration of diverse territories and populations. This era reinforced the Ottoman principle that sustainable power is built over time. Administrative systems were refined, legal codes standardized, economies stabilized, and societies integrated gradually. The calm rhythm of governance allowed the empire to thrive, creating a durable framework capable of supporting centuries of influence and expansion. In essence, the Ottoman Golden Age was not simply a period of grandeur and conquest. It was a slow, methodical, and deliberate process of governance, integration, and refinement, a quiet but powerful demonstration that lasting strength is often the result of patient, incremental effort rather than sudden triumph. Gradual decline, slow changes, and the persistence of the empire. After centuries of careful expansion, consolidation, and integration, the Ottoman Empire eventually entered a period of gradual transformation. This era is often characterized by historians as the beginning of Ottoman decline, but even in this period, the empire's methods reflected patience, slow adaptation, and incremental change. Rather than collapsing suddenly, the empire's evolution was a drawn-out process, marked by both continuity and gradual shifts in governance, economy, military, and society. Slow administrative challenges. The Ottoman administrative system, refined over centuries, began to face challenges that unfolded gradually. Provincial governors gained increasing autonomy, and the central bureaucracy struggled to maintain consistent oversight across the empire's vast territories. Tax collection, once methodical and reliable, began to falter in some regions, though the process was slow and uneven. Rather than abrupt collapse, these administrative issues developed over decades. Central authorities continued to appoint officials, review fiscal practices, and enforce compliance, but systemic inefficiencies accumulated. Incremental corruption, delayed reforms, and local resistance gradually weakened central control, illustrating the importance of consistent, slow governance for maintaining empire-wide cohesion. Economic shifts and trade changes. The Ottoman economy, once carefully managed and integrated, began to experience gradual disruptions. European trade routes evolved, maritime technology advanced, and new markets emerged outside Ottoman control. These changes affected the flow of goods, taxes, and revenue, but the impact was incremental, giving the empire time to adjust. Agriculture, artisanal production, and urban markets remained relatively stable, yet slowly, traditional systems faced pressure from external competition and internal inefficiencies. Efforts to reform taxation, regulate trade, and improve infrastructure were undertaken in measured steps, reflecting the empire's continued preference for gradual adaptation rather than immediate overhauls. Military adaptation and challenges. The Ottoman military, historically a pillar of methodical power projection, also faced gradual challenges. The Janissary Corps, once a highly disciplined force, slowly became less flexible as traditions hardened and recruitment practices changed. Cavalry units and provincial troops were gradually less effective due to shifts in local power dynamics and evolving technology. Despite these slow changes, the empire continued to maintain fortresses, organize supply lines, and train soldiers. Campaigns continued, though with less dramatic frequency and scale than in previous centuries. Even as military effectiveness waned incrementally, the empire preserved its capacity for measured defense and selective expansion. Societal integration and gradual change. Societal cohesion persisted, but slowly, populations within the empire began to experience tensions. Religious and ethnic communities were generally integrated through the millet system, yet pressures such as economic shifts, local unrest, and administrative inefficiencies emerged over time. These challenges did not result in sudden chaos but unfolded gradually, testing the patience and adaptability of Ottoman governance. Education, religious institutions, and charitable organizations continued to function, reinforcing societal stability. Cultural integration, intellectual pursuits, and urban development proceeded steadily, maintaining a sense of continuity even amid subtle signs of structural strain. Diplomatic and external pressures. The empire's diplomatic environment evolved slowly. European powers, including Habsburg Austria, France, and Venice, gradually expanded influence in regions previously dominated by the Ottomans. Rival Islamic powers, such as the Safavids and later the Persians, remained persistent neighbors, influencing trade, politics, and military strategy. Rather than facing sudden invasions or diplomatic collapse, the Ottomans engaged in patient negotiation, careful treaty-making, and incremental adaptation. Borders were defended methodically, alliances maintained gradually, and minor conflicts resolved without destabilizing the broader imperial structure. Cultural continuity. Even during slow decline, Ottoman cultural and intellectual life remained vibrant. Art, architecture, literature, and scholarship continued to receive state support, and urban centers flourished. Mosques, madrasas, bridges, and marketplaces were maintained and gradually improved, reflecting a continuity of planning and care. The gradual nature of change meant that Ottoman society remained recognizable to its own citizens. Daily life, governance structures, religious observances, and economic practices continued much as they had in the past, preserving cohesion and stability amid slow shifts in power dynamics and regional influence. Gradual territorial adjustments. Over time, the empire experienced slow territorial changes. Borders contracted incrementally, often as a result of treaties, negotiated settlements, or local autonomy movements. Key regions such as parts of the Balkans, North Africa, and Eastern Europe were affected gradually, rather than through sudden conquest or collapse. Each territorial adjustment was accompanied by careful administration, integration of loyal local elites, and maintenance of infrastructure to preserve continuity. This slow process allowed the empire to adapt to changing geopolitical realities while maintaining its core structure. Rather than abrupt loss, regions were redefined incrementally, allowing the empire to persist despite new challenges. The Ottoman Empire's enduring philosophy. The Ottoman experience demonstrates that empires often persist not solely through conquest, but through patient governance, gradual integration, and methodical administration. Even as the empire faced internal and external pressures, it relied on incremental reforms, careful oversight, and slow adaptation to sustain its authority. Military, administrative, economic, and cultural systems were all characterized by patience and deliberation. Expansion was deliberate, governance incremental, and social integration methodical. Even during periods often labeled as decline, the Ottoman Empire's survival depended on this slow, persistent approach to maintaining cohesion. Final reflections. In conclusion, the history of the Ottoman Empire is a testament to the power of patience, gradualism, and meticulous statecraft. From its early conquests under Osman and Orhan, through the deliberate naval expansions of Mehmed II, the consolidation under Bayezid II, the eastern campaigns of Selim I, and the Golden Age under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's strength rested on incremental, methodical action. Even in its later centuries, as challenges emerged and power dynamics shifted, the empire persisted through careful adaptation and slow governance. The Ottoman story is not only about dramatic battles or sudden victories, it is about the quiet, persistent rhythm of administration, social integration, economic management, and cultural continuity. This methodical approach allowed the empire to endure for over 6 centuries, illustrating the enduring value of patience, strategy, and gradualism in the art of empire building. The Ottoman Empire's slow, deliberate progression across time and space serves as a profound example of how methodical, incremental efforts can sustain human societies, balance diverse populations, and maintain complex political structures across centuries.